Welcome everybody to the 2023 Sustainable Communities Division Symposium on Climate and Equity. We are very pleased to welcome everybody today to this great event. It's our second annual symposium. I'm going to kick things off with a few remarks about the division and what we've been doing, and then we'll get into our agenda for the day. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. So welcome again. The Sustainable Communities Division went through a strategic planning process 2 years ago, in which we refined our vision and our mission. And these statements guide us in the work we do, all the various programs and initiatives that we carry out. And as you can see, our vision is to enable planners to be empowered to create sustainable, resilient, and equitable communities. The response to climate change and the promotion of equity are two very central features in the work we are doing now and into the future. I won't read the whole mission statement, but this is why we exist, and this symposium is just one element in a larger program of activities. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm trying to advance. I'm having a little trouble. There we go. All right. So just to tell you a little bit about the array of things that the division does, we are growing and changing all the time. We are expanding. We have now leadership, which I will like individually thank all of our various leaders in a moment, but some of our committees are expanding to help us carry out the work that I just alluded to. We have 2 brand new leaders for equity, diversity, and inclusion on our executive committee, and they are working on infusing everything we do from our operations to our programming with considerations of how to better promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in our work and in the world of planning. We're developing partnerships with leadership dedicated to that on our executive committee to forge connections with other organizations doing complementary work so that the work that we all do will be more impactful. We play a major role in providing activities and resources at the National Planning Conference. Of course, we're deep into that right now with the Philadelphia conference coming up. We put on a big reception in partnership with other divisions in which we hold our annual awards for excellence in sustainability presentations and other activities that we're involved in at NPC. Membership is growing. We are working on cultivating a diverse membership and a very robust membership of students. Our Climate Champions program is also growing and changing. I believe we have, if I have it right, somebody can correct me later, representation from 16 states. And the group is strong and has developed its own strategic plan, has developed its own video that describes its activities, and making inroads all the time to be effective in its work. As I mentioned before, we hold our yearly Excellence in Sustainability Awards, and this gives us an opportunity to showcase some of the best work around the country in different categories. And then we produce videos that then can be used to spread the word about this. Our communications as a division has been growing by leaps and bounds. Our symposium today is thank you to the work of our very dedicated communications team. We have, beyond the production of events like today, We produce a biweekly e-bulletin. We have a robust social media and with growing followers in all those areas. And we post on our new website many different resources for the sustainability planning community. We are also, we've been for a long time involved in the smart cities movement, especially under the leadership of our former chair, Robert Kearns. And then there's other policy leadership work going on at all times. The division was instrumental in the development of the Climate Change Policy Guide for APA and the recent PAS report, primer on mitigation and adaptation for planners, in which our past chair, Matt Buchin, was integrally involved. We'll be hearing him speak momentarily. We also have been spearheading the Sustainability and Resilience Speaker Series, which I'll also be speaking about in a little bit in more detail. Of course, this symposium is a new venture for us. This is our second annual, so thanks for coming back for the second one. We're very excited to have this continue. We make a fair amount of grants to assist with education of planners in sustainability and in general, but we make grants especially to help planners attend the NPC. And this year we're devoting a significant portion of that budget to supporting equity, diversity, and inclusion candidates to attend NPC and have all of those networking and career development opportunities available to them. And further, we're planning to offer a tuition scholarship for an EDI candidate this year. We do all this thanks to the support of our members, people like you who are watching. We really appreciate that you spend your membership dollars on Sustainable Communities Division. It helps us do everything that we do. And then the other major reason, of course, that we can perform in the way that we do is with the help of all of these volunteers. There are so many that they almost don't fit on this slide, but you can see that we have a lot of different portfolios of work within the umbrella of the division. We have our partnerships committee, which are responsible for bringing us this event today. Thank you so much, Shannon and Donnie, for all that you did to make this happen. We have our education and practice co-chairs who carry out the awards program and other educational activities, our brand new equity, diversity, and inclusion chairs, for which we are grateful. We have a very dynamic membership chair who is looking at ways to enhance and diversify our membership. The policy leadership area run by Tamara Cook is where we generally get involved in APA and otherwise to extend our reach on sustainability leadership. We have leadership for our National Planning Conference activities, Emma Strong, who is working hard right now to get things organized, and a brand new Students and Emerging Professionals chair, Bethany Bella, who leads the many activities that we conduct for students and professionals just entering the profession. In fact, we have a brand new blog that has been very well received, and hopefully if you have students in your midst, you will connect them with this resource as we grow that part of our work. Our Climate Champions process, as I said, has been growing, and we have a very dedicated volunteer, Christina Furman, working on that to lead those efforts and help to strategically bring that group along. And you can see on the right side of the slide, this is our team of communications people who are working very hard behind the scenes to keep a regular flow of information coming out from the division. And they do it in a very professional and beautiful way, and we thank them so much. And we are very fortunate to be well supported by the past leadership of the division who continue to be involved. Matt Buchin, Scott Turner, Robert Kearns, they are all still very much involved in the division and provide guidance and leadership that we very much appreciate. The other huge thank you is to our sponsors. We have a robust set of annual sponsors, many of whom have come back year after year to support the division, and we are just grateful for their support because it allows us to do the programs that we do. And we hope that other organizations might consider joining in this group. It's an opportunity to have great visibility within the planning world. Our social media and our e-bulletins reach a very large audience, and it's a very cost-effective way to have visibility for your profession, your organization, and keep yourself in front of other eyes. We do have among those 2 university sponsors, and we're always looking to expand that as well and maintain those connections with the academic community. And I think at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to speak a little bit about today's agenda. Shannon?
Thank you so much, Carla. As Carla said, I'm Shannon Roberts. I'm a senior urban planner at Jacobs and the partnerships chair for the Sustainable Communities Division. And I'm proud to be introducing our 2nd annual symposium focusing on climate change and equity. As a member of the Oneida Tribe of Wisconsin, I'm keenly aware of the need to have a variety of voices on this important subject matter. This year, we extended invitations to professionals from all 4 time zones, working in the public, private, and non-for-profit sectors, and strive for both gender and racial representation. We are thrilled to have a wonderful lineup of subject matter experts in climate change, resilience, and equity for today's symposium. On our first session, we will be getting to climate action, tools and resources, highlighting the tools and guidance on climate change that were developed by division leadership for all planners as they integrate climate adaptation and resilience into their practices. As part of this leadership, we continue to provide opportunities for our membership to earn continuing education credits in sustainability and through our Sustainability and Resiliency webinar series. Our second session, Decarbonization, Operational and Embodied, will be starting at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This session will be moderated by my co-chair, Donnie Goris-Kolb, and we'll explore how the focus of climate action is moving towards decarbonization and what that means at the federal, state, and municipal project levels. I'll be moderating the third and final session, which is on applying systems thinking, and is starting at 3:30 Eastern Standard Time today. This panel will highlight how they're applying systems thinking in their work and where they'd like to see it expand in the future. You'll be able to learn how system thinking can really strengthen nearly every aspect of our cities if it's applied in a holistic manner. I did want to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We'll be monitoring the chat and providing opportunities and questions throughout the symposium today. We look forward to hearing your questions and welcome active participation through the chat. Please note that we'll be taking 10-minute breaks between the sessions, and we'll post the slide that's on the screen right now, which will be a reminder as to where we are in the symposium during those breaks. Lastly, the Zoom webinar is available for 3.5 CM credit hours, and it will be recorded and available as an on-demand webinar in the future. So with that, I'd like to welcome our first speaker for session 1, Matt Buchin, and he will introduce the current APA tools and resources.
All right, can you all see me and hear me okay? Anyone?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, excellent. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. I too am really excited to have this second SCD Sustainability Climate Symposium. It's something that we talked about a couple years ago about how can we offer continual education across multiple fronts for our members and for our allied professionals. And so we're excited about this one. I'm going to start the conversation off with a really just a kind of a deep dive in all the things and tools that APA and SCD has been working on for the past couple of years in developing resources for planners to take climate action. The important part of this is I'm going to just briefly jump into kind of the importance of why climate change is something we should be focused on and really taking to heart. But at this point in the world, we've seen tons and tons and tons of basic presentations on climate change, climate action, and we're at the point where we need to get off high center as planners and move forward. And so my portion of the presentation is to say, hey, there's a lot of tools and resources that we've developed, and they're at your fingertips. And so I'm going to walk through them with you. I am in my professional job, a deputy practice leader with HAF. We're a mid-sized AE firm based out of Texas. We have, I think, about 30 offices all across the South. I get to interact with all of our planners and landscape architects across the company. And then my involvement in this presentation and this topic has historically been through my 10 years of volunteering with APA's Sustainable Communities Division, including being their immediate past chair for a couple more months before Meryl steps into that position and I just become an emeritus. But I also played a core contributing authorship of APA's Climate Change Policy Guide. That was through APA's Legislative and Policy Committee, but everyone on that project in the development of that guide was all Sustainable Communities Division members. And then I was the co-author of APA's recently published, I think it was December 2022, PAS report on climate mitigation and adaptation. I'll be kind of going through that today. All of the information that I'm going to cover is available on SCD's website. Here's the links if you want to look at this after the presentation or in the recording that'll be provided. But really, you can go to www.apascd.com and you'll be able to find everything that we're talking about, at least I'm talking about. So briefly, why is climate change important to planners? So this is some of the key takeaways from the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation PS report. And it's as simply as climate change is getting worse, and it's getting worse at an increasing rate. The impacts of climate change are not only intensifying, but they're also not equal. And so we'll have many population segments that will face the brunt of this more than others. Our global responses to address climate change have not been enough. I'll touch on that just a little bit later about the gap between where we say we want to be and where we are today. The US will have to continue to take a leadership role in advancing this conversation. And everything that we do as planners are involved with the sectors of the natural and built environments where climate change action can be infused. In order for us to really make some quick advances, planners are going to have to take a leadership role in this conversation. And so kind of the global community has galvanized around this 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, net zero by 2050. We're not currently meeting those commitments, but every year that we don't, it becomes a moving target of something that's going to have to be quicker, more rapid, faster, more intense in order for us to solve the issue. So here is some of the global greenhouse gas emissions scenarios that were used in the last IPCC report related to identifying kind of pathways where you could model different impacts and changes. You can see the historical rise. If we didn't do anything, what would be going to? You can see the current policies that are out there get us to that 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius. If we meet our pledges and targets, we get to 2.1, but none of those things are getting us close to kind of the global commitment set in the Paris Climate Agreement, which was to basically keep global warming to way less than 2 degrees Celsius with a preferred hit of 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is a later kind of version of this showing that, that even from between now and 2030, there is a huge gap between where we need to be to get to that 1.5 target and where we actually are. And then so why does this matter? Well, as you all see in the news every day, and many of your communities are dealing with, the impacts of climate change are getting much worse. They're getting much costly, and they're intensifying all across the US. So we have another $18 billion weather and climate events that we had last year. I'm not going to dive into all the data, but you can just kind of even see the trends going back the last 40 years. And you can see not only is the number of events increasing, these billion-dollar events, these impacts from climate change, but it's also, you can see it's widening in the number of events that are occurring. And things such as that you don't even really see on here, like in the severe storm count, we're starting to see things like, extreme cold and what that does to our grid and things of that sort. And so here's just kind of a list of a whole bunch of climate change impacts. I won't go through them, but impacting our communities with decreased grid reliability, extreme weather disruptions. Just 2 years ago, Texas had the winter storm event Uri that wiped out many portions of our electrical grid and our gas supplies. Pretty much we had people out of energy, out of electricity for days and sometimes weeks. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had another event that certain areas of the state went down, and it's happening on an increasing basis. Wildland urban interface issues, decreased water supplies, you see that in news every day. Of course, we're all experiencing increased urban heat and urban flooding. Our coastal communities, our natural systems are experiencing issues with sea level rise. Eventually, that'll start to talk about, people migration. We're seeing increased insurance rates because of these events. Natural systems, reduced biodiversity, everything that we pretty much interact with on our natural and built environments as planners are having impacts from climate change. And then, of course, as I mentioned in the beginning, climate change unfortunately impacts our more vulnerable and disadvantaged communities at a greater rate. And so that's why you see at least SCD trying to advance the conversation of equity in everything that we do, because as planners, it's going to have to be front and center along with climate change to ensure that we are prioritizing our efforts where people need them most. And then our two sources of, you'll see some of this later, you've seen this in dozens of presentations. It's a dual focus of both climate mitigation, which is reducing the sources of greenhouse gas emissions so that we slow and stop and reverse future climate change and its impacts. And then as these impacts occur and get intensified and worse, then we more and more have to adapt to the changes in the environment that are out there. So mitigation and adaptation. And so finally, why planners? So we're the only profession out there that have this comprehensive perspective and long-range outlook. A lot of times we're not just talking about next year, we're talking about 20, 30, 40 years down the road. We're one of the few disciplines that focus on place-based problems and at the same time that talk about health, safety, and the general welfare. We're trained to spot the unintended consequences and the cumulative impacts that will happen over time if we don't insert certain things at point A. And then everything that will move forward with climate change, whether mitigation or adaptation, is going to require a community conversation. And that's the one thing that planners specialize in, is engagement, facilitation, consensus building. And then we're oftentimes strategically placed within a community where we're inserted or we intersect with everything that goes on in the development process, things of that sort. So it's really important for us to go front and center on this. I'm borrowing this slide from a friend, Ben Eldridge, from the previous presentation that we did. And the conversation is, well, why you? Well, it doesn't matter if you're retiring, doesn't matter if you're a young planner, you or your children or your grandchildren, the stuff that we're dealing with today up until 2100 is the populations that we will be impacted most. We've caused the problems. It's our job to fix them. And if you're not ones that care about people and you're more focused on, projects and infrastructure, oftentimes the stuff that we intersect with have a design life that are, 10 or 50 years in the making. The reality is, because of limited budgets and competing priorities, it may stay in the ground for a minimum 20 years all the way out through 100 years. So why you? Well, because it's going to continue to impact you, your children, and your grandchildren directly. So what are some of the tools that have been developed by APA and SCD for planners? I'm going to start with a slide that we did past this fall. We did a survey through our membership and through social media to tell you what are the most important things planners need to achieve their outcomes. This was a fall survey. Ordinance language, help with climate goals and strategies, example information on specific sectors, templates, better data, networks for peer-to-peer learning, et cetera, et cetera. And as you're going to see, this is stuff that we've been working on for the past 3, 4, 5 years. So here's some of the tools I'm going to briefly go through: the Climate Change Policy Guide, the PAS report, a couple tools that SCD developed in partnership with the Great Plains Institute. That's the Climate Data Collection Process Guide, the Climate Development Review Checklist, the Climate Ordinance Summary. And then I'm going to dive into some educational things that are out there between SCD and APA. And when we hit number 8, I'm going to transition it. We're going to shift over to Carla to take us through that. But it's something that SCD has been working on to advance this conversation for planners. So first one, number 1, the Climate Change Policy Guide. This was a comprehensive replacement to the 2008 policy guide. It represents APA's official position, policy position on critical issues related to climate change. We organized it using the Comp Plan Standards for Sustaining Places framework. We did that because we wanted to make sure that we were providing guidance to planners across all spectrums of things that we felt the climate conversation can be inserted into. We added some things based on policy and state stuff. What I really love about this policy guide is it has the overarching 7 general policy statements, but then goes into 51 specific policy statements with explanations. So it provides you that content to pull right into reports and strategies. And in this particular policy guide, which is somewhat different than many, also included 253 supporting strategies with explanations, so that as you're going to come up with your action strategies, things of that sort, you can go here and find things at your fingertips. So how can you use the policy guide? You can incorporate the policy statements into your chapter and state-based legislative policy platforms. Right now, when I serve on APA Texas's Legislative and Policy Committee and their Environment and Healthy Community Subcommittee, I went to this guide and other guides as we were developing our policy statements to become part of our state-based policy platform. You can integrate the policy statements directly into your specific plan elements of long-range plans. Some of our communities specifically, or some of our states actually, specifically require policy statements, such as work that we've done in Oklahoma, work that we've done in Florida, where these policy statements are already at your fingertips without you having to go think of things from scratch. You can use the reframed language from the policy statements to serve as guiding principles for decision-making. You can use the strategies as action strategies in all of your long-range plans. And anything in this document you can use for language for educational presentations to your elected appointed officials, your stakeholders, et cetera. The Climate Mitigation and Adaptation PAS report, number 601. This was a comprehensive replacement to the 2010 one on energy and climate. It's pretty much, the way I describe it, is kind of like a comprehensive plan for climate understanding for planners. So it includes kind of background information on the climate emergency or crisis. It goes into a whole chapter on kind of the key things you need to know on climate science. You got to be very cognizant of, though, that climate science and climate numbers changed literally daily as we worked on this for 2 years. Updated reports from IPCC, the national U.S. National Climate Assessment. Even when we were writing it, we had to go back and change some numbers. It's moving fast, but at least it provides you a comprehensive understanding. And then it goes into 2 chapters on mitigation, kind of laying out what climate mitigation is and then how do planners do climate mitigation, and then 2 more chapters on climate adaptation. Same thing. What is climate adaptation? How do planners use or do climate adaptation? And then there's 2 chapters on case studies. So 1 chapter on mitigation case studies and 1 chapter on adaptation. And then the last chapter is all about some of the things I'm going to go through next. So it includes 10 principles for climate action. So understanding to help you think of things that you need to feed into your process, like whole systems thinking, flexible cross-development, cross-sector strategies, planning for multi-benefit outcomes, education, et cetera, et cetera. We also laid out a 10-step climate planning framework, something that you can pull directly into your plans, your processes, whatever it might be. But it's basically founded on 3 core elements, and that is the understanding that we're going to have to be doing a lot of consensus building. We're going to have to do a lot of engagement for prioritization, and this whole thing is going to require us to be thinking about how do we educate as we plan at the same time. And then it walks through 10 steps with explanations about kind of the framework that you can feed right into your planning element. All this is further explained in the PS report. It did include 12 case studies, 7 on mitigation, 5 on adaptation. We specifically picked these case studies so that it reflected a variety of different jurisdictions, entities, scales, locations. So it's got state stuff, regional stuff, local stuff, county, city. It's got different types of climate impacts like, extreme heat, king tides, resort community, whatever you can think of. We pulled these 12 together to, there's the second one there. And then, so how can you use these case studies? Well, each one of them have a background introduction. They have key takeaways. And then everything in those case studies has embedded hyperlinks to different types of plans and resources, goals and policies, examples of vulnerability assessments, mapping tools, resources, ordinances. Anything you could possibly think of, you don't have to go think of from scratch. And then outside of that, embedded in this document, there's also a complete list of glossary of terms, so you don't have to be making these up. We have a summary of all the other climate resources, whether policy guides or other PS reports, pointing you to specific areas, so you can go right to the resources that you may need most. And then it also includes 14 pages of strategies as well. So as you're thinking about what type of actions to do in your plans, you can go there to understand things that you can apply across all 8 sectors. And then there's over 250 links to online resources in the appendices of this for other research that's out there that's available for you. So how can you use this report? It's a comprehensive, it's a foundational educational resource for our planners to understand both climate mitigation and adaptation. You can use any of the text, graphics, content in the plans content for your plans, for your presentations. You definitely use the case study links to go and find, examples of what does a subsector plan look like? What does this look like? To get specific goals and action strategies that have already been developed and then apply them to your jurisdiction. And utilizing those cross-reference links for deeper dives on other research for specific topics. Other climate tools, this is topic 3, 4, and 5, or tool 3, 4, and 5. These are the ones that we developed in concert with the Great Plains Institute. We've got a data collection process guide that's broken down by sectors. We've developed a kind of a development review checklist to help understand how to move forward in the development process, and then a comprehensive list of both model and example, like actually enacted language that you can filter by topic. So how can you use these tools? The data collection process guide, it gives you the opportunity to explore those topics, identify specific national data sets or data resources that you can then pull into your plan. They're all hyperlinked for you. The development review checklist really helps you understand the questions and the multi-topic points of insertion, where you can insert a climate consideration into your development review process. And then the climate ordinance summary, again, has a whole ton of enacted ordinances that are out there from across the country. You can filter by different resources, different locations, different sizes, whatever you want. It also has that model legislation. But the point is, these resources are at your fingertips so that you don't have to start from scratch. APA Planning Magazine is consistently putting out climate educational pieces. And then another just fantastic resource that was updated in 2022 is APA's Climate Change Research Knowledge Base Collection. So you get onto planning.org, you go to, I think it's the knowledge or whatever is the main thing, you get into the knowledge base collection and you can see the different topics, but you can click on each one of these, and APA has collected over the years examples, podcasts, reports, books, interactive map, toolkits, all these things that you can click on. So you have these resources at your fingertips. And then number 8, this is the Sustainability and Resilience CM credit series. I'm going to turn that over to Carla, but before I do, just want to reconnect you with all these resources that we've talked about are available through the SCD website, apascd.com. Under the papers, policies, and guides is some of them. Under the stuff that Carla is going to talk about is under the Sustainability and Resilience series link. And then I'm going to end with the ending point of the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation PS report. And it talked about identifying a planner's commitment for moving forward. And we laid out 4 things. One was get educated through stuff like this and through all the resources that I just talked about. Number 2 was talk about it. And this is pulling from Catherine Hayhoe's work to say the best thing that we can do is just initiate the conversation with our coworkers, our bosses, our committees, our councils, our friends and neighbors to continue to aggregate this conversation moving forward. Network, understanding there's other people out there trying to do the same thing as you, so let's work with each other on it. And then number 4 was promote policy and take action. And I've said this before, where I've talked about what policy is, and policy really is anything that we can do with our communities to move the ball forward. It could be a policy statement, it could be regulations, it could be a plan, it could be a conversation, it could be education. Whatever your policy preference is, let's start to move that ball forward because we're running out of time and we do really need to take action now. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm sure I went long. And turn it over to Carla. Carla, I think you're still on mute.
Hello, everybody. Can I be heard by everybody? I hope so.
Yes.
Thank you, Matt, for that incredible overview of the tools and resources that are available to planners, brought to you in part by the Sustainable Communities Division. It really is an amazing array of resources for us in our professional lives, so we hope that you will take advantage. My job right now is to tell you about just one of those tools that is available to you through APA, and that is the APA Sustainability and Resilience series, which is an educational resource that in part was created to fulfill AICP requirements for sustainability and resilience credit. And I'm going to get into the specifics of that. That's something that the Sustainable Communities Division has taken leadership on creating and leading, but the series itself is a cross-divisional effort involving many different divisions within APA, which is in part what gives it the interdisciplinary nature that it requires. Let's see here. There we go. Just a little bit about me. I'm Carly Ebenbach, and I am the head of a urban planning consulting practice based in Florida, Ebenbach Consulting. I've been involved with the division for probably about 6 years, a little less than Matt. I'm the chair-elect, and later this spring, our current chair, Meryl St. Ledger, will step down and I will become the chair. And she was unable to be here today, but she is providing tremendous leadership to our division currently. I've been involved with the division in other ways as a secretary treasurer and in other volunteer capacities. I am the current chair of the series steering committee, and I formerly was the chair of the task force which designed the sustainability and resilience credit. And I currently sit as a member on the task force that is considering what will be the next mandatory rotating credit, whether sustainability and resilience will be retired or something will take its place or it will be adapted. All right, so just to tell you about this credit, you're probably well aware because you've had to satisfy it perhaps by now. It's one single credit that is required within your reporting period in sustainability and resilience. And the criteria that we developed for this credit is very wide-ranging and flexible. And so there are many ways to meet the credit. And it was part of a reorganization that AICP undertook to rethink the required educational credits that planners need. And so now it's one of 4 required credits: law, ethics, equity, and sustainability and resilience is the 4th. It took effect beginning of last year, and so hopefully you're all finding your way to the series, which I'll talk about next, to get your credit. Now, the credit is intended, just as the series is, to allow planners to receive education in those areas where they need to learn more about these really important issues that Matt was describing. We all come at our profession from different angles and different orientations geographically, different political atmospheres. So there are some subjects that we need to get up to speed on, and this credit is intended to do that, to raise the level of knowledge and understanding among the profession in general about sustainability and resilience issues, to be ready and able to tackle climate change from wherever we are, wherever we work. And this, the credit was designed to be sort of a flexible umbrella, is often how it was referred to, that addresses sustainability, resilience by having different learning areas and then topics within that. And since it's an evolving field, as Matt alluded to, and science changes regularly, there are new ways to look at and study these topics. And so the credit allows that flexibility so that different kinds of courses can be developed that meet the criteria. Very important to the credit is an essential component of addressing social equity, that there be credentialed, AICP credentialed speakers on the panel, though not exclusively. We're looking for diverse perspectives in any panel that we host. The credit was developed with and started out by saying, what is sustainability? What is resilience? And sometimes we get tired of trying to define our terms, but it is important to get back to it and have a look at what we are trying to accomplish. And so I'm not going to read them out to you, but these are the definitions that the AICP task force came up with as a basis for understanding what we need to learn about. Now, onto the series. So the series, as I said, is the product of the work of multiple divisions working together to find speakers, to put together panels, to systematically go through the topics that are listed for the credit. And you can earn your mandatory AICP CM either by watching a live version of the event or on demand. We have a great partnership with the APA Ohio Planners Webcast Series, who host our events. And in fact, they have a YouTube channel where you can find all the recordings. And I think on one of the upcoming slides, you'll see a link where you can go to find all those recordings and check them out. This is just to give you a sense of the array of topics that fall under that broad heading of sustainability and resilience in terms of the credit. So the series also in turn tries to address these in one way or another, and we have hit many of the topics already, and we continue to add more events to the series. To let you know that on demand currently on that YouTube channel, you can see the link down at the bottom. We already have these 10 sessions, 10 I say because the first two had two sessions each. These available recordings constitute a library of resources, which you can share with your colleagues, which you can view on your own time if you wanted to get up to speed on one aspect or another. I mean, you could see those all the way from extreme weather trends to the basics of climate science, to diving into some technology tools, funding tools, some technology tools in terms of the, the alternative energy resources. And of course, we've already done a fantastic session on planning for equity. Most recently, that's our most recent session. And our session on planning in Native American communities touched on public health. So it gives you a sense of the wide array of topics that we are working on and continue to work on. Coming up next month are these two sessions, which I believe registration is either open or is about to open on these. In March, we will have on the 17th, advancing large-scale climate resilient projects through planning and financing with HUD and DOT perspectives. That's another federal funding tools event, which is very timely. Then next in March, we have the Climate Planner Strategies for Engaging on Climate When It's Challenging. It's this, actually, you know what? I think the title changed since I did that, but it focuses on regions where flooding occurs and other issues like that. In any case, look for registration soon. We hope you'll join us. There are many other events in the works for later on in the year. And if you are interested in working with the series, either as a volunteer or in speaking, I hope you'll reach out to me. I'm always looking for great ideas for webinars, so I look forward to hearing from anybody who wants to get involved. And I believe I am right on time, so I'm going to just pass it right on over back to Shannon.
Hi, everybody. We have about a 10-minute break now. I did see some questions come in into the chat for Matt and Carla. I don't know if you guys want to answer those live, but I'm going to put up the agenda for the day for our 10-minute break, and we will be back at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So let me do that right now. But Matt and Carla, do you guys want to hop on your cameras and
Sure.
see if there's anything you want to answer here?
Yeah, I got some answers for the ones that started to come through. One was related to are there any resources on climate change in NEPA? I just kind of responded in text on that. I don't know exactly every example of stuff that we pulled into our resources over the past couple of years, but just a quick look on the internet. There's a whole website from EPA exactly on that topic. So climate change guidance for National Environmental Policy Act reviews. It's got a resource and toolkit page and everything. So I think that'll be a good resource if you haven't found one through our resources that we developed. And then I'll take a quick stab at another question related to one of the questions was how has SCD been engaged with Planning 2050? So we worked with Julio all the way back when this Julio Carrillo, who's been leading this effort, he's part of our division, but he's been working on this effort for several years now. And back when it was just an idea, we had brought him in to engage with our Climate Champions program, to start using them as a resource to move that effort forward. And so we still stay in the conversation with Julio in research and as part of his brain trust as he keeps pushing that effort forward. And Carl, I don't know if you know any more on that than I do.
No, I think that sums it up. And there was a question about putting the links into the chat. So certainly I will put the link for the SNR series recordings into the chat right now.
If there aren't any more questions, we can take our formal break, and everybody, please be back at your computers in about 8 minutes, and we will be starting our next session at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on decarbonization, operational and embodied.
Thank you.
Welcome back from the break. I'm going to hand over the next session to my co-chair, Donnie. Is Donnie on?
Yep,
Donnie,
I'm here.
okay.
Okay, great. Thanks, Shannon. So welcome back, everybody. This is our second session during which our 5 panelists will be exploring decarbonization and what it means at the federal, state, and municipal levels, as well as at the project level. My name is Donnie Gores-Kolb, Senior Sustainability Planner at VHB, based in Watertown outside of Boston, Massachusetts. My team has the pleasure of working on a variety of different climate action planning and implementation projects, from net zero emission roadmaps to greenhouse gas emission inventories, hazard mitigation plans, sustainable building design guidelines, waste assessments, electric vehicle charging stations, and more. We're excited by all the work that we get to do. Our company is also a principal supporter of the ISI and the Envision rating system for sustainable infrastructure. But now I'd like to give praise to our panelists for volunteering to share their experiences with you today. Up first is Lance Davis, who will be providing an overview of what's happening at the federal level, particularly at the GSA. Lance is the program manager for design excellence, architecture, and sustainability for the Chief Architect's Office within GSA's Public Building Service in Washington, D.C. After Lance will be Chad Laurent, who will focus on the state level efforts by describing his work at the Cadmus Group on the decarbonization roadmap for the state of Massachusetts. I've had the pleasure of working with Chad on a number of occasions, currently on the program management side of Massachusetts Port Authority's Net Zero Roadmap. Chad specializes in renewable energy law and policy, sustainable business strategies, and renewable energy project development. Following Chad will be Professor John Nolan, who will be discussing his work at the city level, underlining the fact that approximately 70% of carbon emissions can be controlled at the local government level. Mr. Nolan is a distinguished professor of law at the Elizabeth Halb School of Law at Pace University, where he supervises student research and publications regarding land use, sustainable development, climate change, housing insecurity, racial inequity, and the COVID pandemic. Maxine Paul will dovetail Mr. Nolan's presentation by showcasing projects at the regional and local levels and how they attack tackling decarbonization. Ms. Paul leads development at Adelante, and for the last 15 years, she has worked to build organizational capacity and solve environmental problems in New Mexico. And most recently, she built the environmental division at the Pueblo of Santa Ana, overseeing new programs in air quality cleanup of formerly used defense sites, brownfields, solar energy planning, and climate resilience. And last but not least, Greg Mella of Smith Group. Greg will be discussing the project level case studies that address decarbonization. Greg is a pioneer and nationally recognized expert in sustainable design. Over the past 20 years, he has risen to become one of the nation's leading authorities on a myriad of green design topics and initiatives, including net zero energy design. But before we begin, I'd like to kick things off with some level-setting questions to give today's participants insight on what decarbonization is and how definitions can vary based on unique perspectives. So if all of my panelists will turn on their video, that would be certainly appreciated. But up first, Chad, how do you define decarbonization within the context of your past and current work?
Hey, Donnie, and thanks for having me, everyone. I would say currently it's the phrase du jour in terms of climate efforts related to climate mitigation and also adaptation. So the terms get used over the years. There have been different terms, a climate action plan or a sustainability initiative or 100% renewable energy strategy or a transition to electric vehicles, strategic electrification. These are all the terms that get sort of thrown around, and currently they sort of are all falling under this umbrella of decarbonization. I personally have sort of mixed thoughts on the term because I think there are more than just carbon emissions that result in climate impacts and also pollution impacts. And oftentimes, if you're reducing your carbon intensity or your use of or emissions related to carbon by not burning fossil fuels, you're also emitting other pollutants that contribute to asthma and public health and other public health impacts. And so it isn't, while it's being called decarbonization lately, it also is not just a focus on carbon. Typically among cities, states, and governments that are taking initiatives to essentially stop burning fossil fuels to create things that we need for our society to function.
All right, great. Thank you for those clarifications, which leads me to my next question about misconceptions. What is one misconception about decarbonization, and how does this affect our ability to make progress in this area? Maxine?
Thanks, Donnie. Actually, I'm really glad that Chad mentioned that, how many terms we've had around climate action. I think that it leads into sort of two misconceptions around decarbonization. One is that decarbonization equals renewables. So decarbonization is going to be everything, not just switching from fossil fuels to solar when we have it in storage, but energy efficiency upgrades, EV charging stations. So this massive project that really is thousands and thousands of projects and billions of dollars. The second thing would be that, and this is sort of within one of the topics that I'm going to get into, but I think that decarbonization really can be used as a buzzword, like sustainability has been used. It really can be used for greenwashing. You're going to hear it a lot in the oil and gas industry, strangely. And I'll get into that, where that a lot of that is valid and based on, decreasing carbon intensities, but you'll also just hear it sort of thrown around like, without a direct correlation to how much something is truly decreasing greenhouse gases. So yeah, I liked what Chad said about terms. So I think that has a lot of impact about how we talk about these things. So I'm glad we're all on the same page there.
Okay, great. I think your answers are flowing right perfectly into the next questions here. So Maxine mentioned how renewables might be misconstrued as the main element of decarbonization. Greg, what one aspect of decarbonization that you wish the broader community were giving more attention to, and maybe related to Maxine's answer, what is one aspect that we are giving maybe too much attention to?
Well, and this relates to what I'm going to talk about, but we haven't mentioned the terms embodied carbon yet. And that is a huge part of embodied carbon that of decarbonization that often doesn't get a lot of recognition. And I think if you look at the carbon targets that we need to get to by the end of this decade, and you look at the sources of where that carbon's coming from, you realize that embodied carbon is really critical, perhaps more critical than anything else right now. And that's a really nuanced topic, and we'll talk more about it, but it's not just about picking low embodied carbon materials. It's about building less and making do with what we have. And I think from a planner's perspective, that's a really rich topic that we'll get into. So that's what we're not talking about enough. enough. I think we are talking too much maybe about technology and renewables, because to me, that's the last piece of the puzzle that we really need to focus on: adaptive reuse, energy efficiency, passive design, getting by without becoming so resource driven, circular economy, and then at the very end, renewables.
Yeah, so certainly embodied carbon is part of the evolving nature of the work that folks are doing with decarbonization. But Lance, what excites you about this evolving practice?
That's funny, actually, that you would think that we've almost planned these questions, but it is it is actually where the marketplace is going with embodied carbon. We are having conversations with manufacturers now that you wouldn't think would be into it. The cement industry, the steel industry are having very robust conversations about how they can make their products and still be a viable element within a building, but do it with less carbon along the way. And they've got some really innovative techniques, and it's really exciting to see how that's all changing, and then how we can then affect other building materials, and then have in our toolbox this amazing kit of materials that we can choose from that are low embodied carbon. And I think that's going to be really exciting over the next few years as that changes and we have more options coming before us.
Okay, great. And I'm going to invite John to Professor Nolan to join us as well. Just an extra kudos to Professor Nolan. He's joining us from Mexico today. So John?
I should have done this from the patio. Sorry about that.
Made us all jealous.
I'm going to Miami and I brought my suit with me, so I put it on thinking you people would look respectable, but I was wrong about that too. Well, thank you, Donnie. We've been following climate action plans since they were initiated 30 years ago, and we've been helping local governments with what we've been calling low carbon land use. And my students do nothing but sit there and look around the country and find out among our 40,000 local governments who's doing low carbon land use. And that involves all the things that you guys all know about, from renewables and operational energy and the energy code and walk-up buildings and TOD and compact mixed use development that can move a carbon emission metric per capita from 35 to 10 if you do it right. But what's exciting to me about this is that it gives us a really, I didn't know, because I only learned what I find from local governments until local governments about a year and a half ago started to embody decarbonization strategies in their local codes. I didn't realize what a tremendous potential this topic has for really lowering fossil fuel emissions.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. So I'm going to pass it off to the panelists now. So Lance, can you share your presentation? And then I'll go ahead and ask you to pass it off to Chad once you're done with your slides.
Gotcha. Are they up and visible and everyone can hear me okay?
Yeah,
okay,
good.
Beautiful. All right. So I've got a short amount of time to get through a lot of information here, because about a year and a half ago, a little less than 2 years ago, I wouldn't have had too much to say. But it is amazing what has changed in a year and a half, 2 years. And so we're going to try to cover a lot of what's been happening on the federal level and how federal agencies and specifically GSA is addressing it. So this is me. I'm Lance Davis. I'm the sustainability architect for GSA. And if you're not aware of GSA, we are the largest civilian landlord in the US government, got about 1 million federal employees in our space. And in our inventory, we manage about 377 million rentable square feet around the country. So pretty good size, lots of fun buildings. Here are some of the buildings that we have in our inventory, all over the place. And, historic buildings make up about 1/3 of our inventory. We've got some great brand new buildings. And although we don't take care of the residents, we do take care of the offices at the White House. So that's always a fun part of the job. And then, so this is one of the documents that we have out there that we give to all of our design teams. It's P100. And if you're doing federal work for GSA, you should definitely be aware of this. And if not, just to be aware of some of the aspects that are in P100. And I'll hit a couple of these along the way. And so in 2017, we actually introduced this idea of energy net zero to federal buildings. Basic concept was you design a building, you make it as efficient as you possibly can. We recognize that we're not getting budgets in a lot of cases to put enough renewables on these projects, but they should be designed to be energy net zero. And then if we have enough budget using this sort of performance scale, we have a baseline and then 3 performance levels, looking for our design teams to be able to install some amount of renewables on those projects. And so that's where we really sort of started along this effort, I think back in 2017. And this is just a basic concept, you know, if you've got a site plan, but this is really, I think, important from a planning standpoint. And truthfully, I have several architects just and being an architect, several architects just don't get this concept of sort of planning for the future on a particular project. So here's a typical illustrative site plan. You go, okay, great. This is an area, we've got enough budget that we can put PV over here. We could probably put some future PV here. And if we look at the site, there's probably a swath of land that we can put some panels over here. But in that thinking, we also want to make sure that we're actually designing and running that conduit pathways where that 5 years, 10 years from now, we're not having to go through and rip up the parking lot and rip up the landscaping and the artwork that's out there, and making sure those pathways are in place and they're going to the electrical room, and that all of this makes sense, that someone's thought through this whole process so that in the end, we can have just a really basic, simple calculation, and this all would be located on one drawing. And the idea is, if we do get money and from Congress, that we can pull out these drawings and go, okay, hey, here, this building can put so many panels on it. We're ready. Hopefully, the technology is more efficient and we can get more energy out of the panels we're putting on now. But at least we know where they can go and we've planned for it. And so that's the whole idea behind this energy net zero ready. Next piece we added in was going to Architecture 2030 and requiring it as from our design teams to try to achieve the EUIs coming out of that. We recognize that fossil fuel free buildings were part of legislation in Section ESA 433, Energy Independence and Security Act. And so by 2030, we're looking to get to zero fossil fuels per this executive order. And so we were using the 2030 tool for our design teams to go, okay, hey, this is a quick, easy tool. We can quickly find out, you know, what that EUI should be. It gives them a really interesting target to try to achieve. We have some buildings that are very high intense energy users. And so trying to change something like a land port of entry and get them down into the low 20s, if not teens, has been a fun and interesting experience, but we do have some great examples out there. And then we started to identify within this world of decarbonization ways that we should start bringing in that to our design teams. And P100 at the time didn't really have much to it, but it was starting to identify, hey, design teams, let's think about electrification. Let's think about embodied carbon. Let's be careful about what we're starting to put into our projects. Carbon sequestration is gaining some momentum. Is there an opportunity to do some of that on site, either with the landscaping and the plantings or through other means, through mechanical means? And then obviously looking at that operational carbon that's going on to the whole thing. So this is where we were roughly with P100. And then also we added this just to give our design team something to think about, saying we weren't quite ready to go to EPDs yet. We were having trouble understanding them ourselves back in 2018. And so we said, hey, design teams, this is a great tool. look at this, be aware of it, think about the materials you're specifying, look for alternatives if need be, or low embodied carbon materials along the way. So then we got this Executive Order 14057, catalyzing clean energy. Lots of stuff in it. Basically, we're moving to net zero emissions by 2045. All of this really trying to get to net zero energy, water, and waste, really climate and sustainability focused workforce. And we had to sort of go through and redo all of our definitions because we were working off this idea of a net zero energy building or a net zero energy ready building, where we were saying, you know, hey, eventually we want to be able to put renewables on there. And now we're here talking about net zero operational emissions buildings where we don't have any fossil fuels being burned in our buildings. And now we're looking at carbon pollution free from the grid, and looking for that even now on a 24/7 eventually here shortly. So now we're having to think about battery storage, or how is this 24/7 aspect provided? And this is just a quick timeline just to show you. I mean, here's when we put out the 2018 P100, sorry, the 2021 P100 back in October, and then 2021. And it's just exploded. Executive orders and new laws that have come out that have just rolled out and really changed how the federal government has to think about decarbonization of our inventory. There's also a lot of money associated with all of this. So in the Recovery Act version, the Inflation Reduction Act that came out, GSA got $250 million for high performance green buildings. We got 975 for emerging and sustainable technologies. And then we got 2.15 billion for low carbon materials. And this is where that embodied carbon comes in. And we've been having these phenomenal discussions with industry, talking to the concrete manufacturers and mom and pops in the middle of nowhere, talking to them about that ability to get cement that is low embodied carbons, where that they can add that to their mixes and get EPDs of their mixes, so where that they can submit them to us for the projects that we need all around the country. So that's been really exciting to see, and it's been really interesting. The EPA, the law says the EPA has to select the materials. So these are the four we've started off with: concrete, asphalt, steel, and glass. We've set a very high or a very low, as it turns out, embodied carbon requirement for these materials. The industry is doing phenomenal. It's sort of reacting to that and trying to find products and get those to us, so where that we can spend this $2.15 billion, which is really exciting and really tough to do, actually, when you're limited to just 4 materials. Hopefully EPA will add a few more items to this list, and we'll be able to get to more of it. So that's all I got time for at the moment, but look forward to answering questions as we go forward. So Chad, I'm gonna stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lance. Let me just make sure this is all ready to go. All right. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Lance. Great context at the federal level. I'm going to go into some more details on what Massachusetts has done in their context for decarbonization, which is the term that they used. And to be clear, I'm just speaking on behalf of myself. I work at the Cadmus Group, which was part of a large team of consultants and experts and professors who worked on the decarbonization roadmap. But to be clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts or any of its agents. We have a new governor here in Massachusetts and some new appointees to the different executive offices. So this is just some of our take on the background, having worked on a couple of the iterations of the reports that help to lay out a roadmap for the Commonwealth to meet its targets. Massachusetts is a state that has codified in law that it has to reach these targets and set up different milestones, which is fairly unique among states in terms of it's not just a target that has been set that can move around or is voluntary. It's actually written into law within the Commonwealth. And it started in 2008 with the Global Warming Solutions Act, which sets certain reduction levels and requires EEA, which is Energy and Environmental Affairs, the division of the agency within the Commonwealth, to set targets and make sure that we're meeting here 80% below statewide emissions by from 1990 by 2050, establishing certain set of regulations and developing business as usual projections for 2020, which is passed, and target emission reductions beyond that. And then in 2021, there was a new law that codified a net zero target by 2050, including an 85% gross emissions economy-wide reduction. And 50% of those have to come by 2030 and 75% by 2040. Requires different subsector limits in terms of transportation and electricity and buildings, and codifies environmental justice language, and then sets forward a timeline for developing the various plans. The plan we've contributed to these, and we worked most closely on the 2050 decarbonization roadmap, and it was a 2-year research effort to look at what is needed in terms of large scale transitions that are capable of achieving net zero by 2050, and what are those estimated feasibility costs and benefits of those sort of economy-wide reductions. One of the first sort of comprehensive statewide reports like it. And then they're informed by the roadmap. There's specific actions that were put forward in the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030. And then more detailed specific actions that the Commonwealth will need to take on its path to net zero by 2050 in the Clean Energy Climate Plan for 2050 update. So a bunch of different reports getting into sort of more and more detail in terms of what actions are required and what investments are going to be required in order to get to net zero. And so what is meant by net zero? It requires an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And so you have the gross emissions, what the Commonwealth is defining net zero as. You have the gross emissions, so all the fossil fuel combustion. You add into that the biogenic combustion of different biofuels, recognizing that some of those are going to be burned in order to meet energy demands. And then you subtract out the net carbon sequestration from forest, wetlands, croplands, and other potential engineered carbon removal and storage. And that has to equal zero by 2050 in order for the Commonwealth to legally meet its target. In terms of a timeline, just another way of illustrating sort of the reductions are not just setting zero by 2050, but there's also interim targets in 2030 and 2040. And again, the legal requirements and the fact that it is a law then would give parties standing to sue the Commonwealth if the Commonwealth was not meeting those targets. Therefore, sort of setting the bar fairly high to get policies and programs in place to move in that direction. So in terms of where the emissions are coming from in Massachusetts, so residential heating is about 19%, commercial heating 11%, transportation 37%, electricity 20%. We don't have a lot of industrial energy usage within the Commonwealth, so that's at 5%. Natural gas system sort of leakage is 1%, which is significant. Industrial processes about 5%, and then different agriculture 2%. Not a lot of agricultural or large industry processes in Massachusetts. And I think one of the biggest shifts, and this is what we're seeing in other parts of the country, is as the electricity grid has switched from predominantly coal to predominantly natural gas, that has decreased the emissions from the electricity sector. And we're also seeing significant increases in renewable energy, making the grid cleaner, so that transportation has, in most places across the country, has a higher emissions associated with it than electricity, which was not the case when I started working on climate plans 20 or so years ago. where electricity was one of the largest sources of emissions. Now it's transportation and buildings that make up the largest pieces of the pie. So the pillars that were identified and pathways to net zero, broadly speaking, were around reducing end use energy. So transitioning buildings, vehicles, and other end uses away from consuming fossil fuels. They just can't keep burning fossil fuels for those purposes. Energy efficiency and flexibility. I think the flexibility is one of the key pieces of that. So aggressive energy efficiency improvements, including existing buildings, not just new buildings or codes and standards for new construction, but how do we help people renovate and retrofit their homes to make them more efficient and electrified? And also grid flexibility that enables cost-effective decarbonization and making sure that we have flexibility built into the electric grid that allows the timing of the use of electricity when it's coming from renewables to match demand, and maybe delaying when your new electric vehicle is charging so as to not create unnecessary impacts on the electric grid. And to Lance's point, to get us to 24/7 carbon-free electricity. We also need to decarbonize the energy supply. You can't electrify everything if then you're just using more fossil fuels to provide all that electricity. We need to produce zero and low carbon energy supplies to power the energy system. So that's predominantly to come from things like wind and solar, hydropower, and also the infrastructure needed to move that power across different geographic regions. And then because we're talking about the Commonwealth, which owns a lot of forest land and open space, carbon sequestration, it's not something that necessarily a company or a city or town would have as much of a potential to increase carbon sequestration. But there's ways that the Commonwealth can improve the management of its land to balance those remaining emissions by having and allowing those lands to take out more carbon than they would have otherwise with sort of smart land management techniques. So in the minutes I have left here, just wanted to highlight some of the different strategies that have been identified. And of course, each of these, could be a presentation on its own. And sort of broadly speaking, one of the key transportation strategies are promoting alternatives to personal vehicle travel. So if you're taking cars off the road, or by replacing them with a robust public transit system, multifamily zoning near transit stations, the MBTA is the public transportation system in Massachusetts, the T or the subway system, making sure that that is working and is modernized, helping employees to reduce single occupancy commutes, electric bikes. Those have really emerged as viable transportation options, especially since the pandemic. So making sure that we're reducing vehicle miles traveled, and then implementing advanced clean emission vehicle sales and standards in terms of what vehicles are allowed to be sold within the Commonwealth, expanding electric vehicle incentives. These are just the names of some of the incentives that are in Massachusetts, the more EV programs, expanding those, accelerating the electrification of fleets, and in particular, those with public health and equity implications. So this includes rideshare vehicles, vehicles for hire, like Uber and Lyft, delivery trucks, school buses. Really need to electrify all of our school buses, and then different grants to community organizations to help them to fund localized reductions in transportation emissions. We need to build out the electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So fast charging along different corridors and in different areas of high use, and then make ready infrastructure and helping the utilities and then cities and towns to build out and make sure that if there isn't the need for an electric vehicle charging station now, that the electric infrastructure is necessary to supply. Recently was talking with a couple of different airports where the rental car companies have gone to a couple of airports, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, that I know of at least, and have said, hey, we're going to electrify our entire fleet of rental cars. We need you to supply us with a bunch of EV charging stations. Here's what we're thinking of. And the total number of the electricity demands of all those electric vehicle charging stations was almost equal to the entire electricity use of the entire airport. So there needs to be a lot of infrastructure built in order to meet the demands of electric vehicles that are coming from rental cars and other places. And then need to engage consumers and facilitate the markets for electric vehicles and you know, emerging sort of larger vehicles as those transition to electric as well. On the building strategies within Massachusetts, looking to try and cap emissions from heating, creating performance benchmarks and different standards, looking at climate finance and centralized technical support for existing buildings. Mass Save is the utility energy efficiency programs that are run in Massachusetts. So expanding those and making sure that all building types are met across all different communities, and then funding infrastructure planning and technology innovation. And again, buildings are really tough because when, you know, a furnace or a hot water heater breaks, it often needs to be replaced within a short amount of time. And it's rare that a homeowner or even a business has a plan in place to make sure that whatever they're swapping that equipment for is going to be an electric version of that. And you only have 1 or 2 opportunities between now and 2050 to convert that piece of equipment to electric without having a bunch of stranded costs associated with fossil fuel infrastructure that then has been sort of baked in. But it's nearly impossible, or it's really hard to plan ahead for those types of events. And so really looking at strategies and programs to help people transition to electric before it's an emergency where something breaks and we need to fix it, and we just need to put in whatever we had in previously instead of making sure that it's transitioning to something like air source heat pumps or an electric water heater. And again, that goes for, you know, trying to help homeowners to be able to do that, but also businesses, nonprofits, and other organizations, especially in a place like Massachusetts that has an older building stock, where we have a lot of buildings that are hundreds of years old and are not necessarily easy to retrofit. On the energy strategies, sort of fairly obvious for those that are working in energy markets, but making sure that there's large clean energy procurements in place for things like offshore wind, making sure that the markets are set up and providing the appropriate incentives for more renewables to come online, trying to coordinate more regionally, both with across the Northeast states, including New York and all the New England states, as well as with Quebec and Canada. Offshore wind was really highlighted as really what is required in order to meet a lot of the renewable energy requirements and electricity requirements to electrify Massachusetts. And then distribution system modernization, again, making sure that the infrastructure is there to deliver that power where it's needed, and making sure that it's a just energy transition, and that communities that have a higher burden of their income going to energy costs are not left out, and that costs do not increase for those who, again, a larger share of their income is going to pay for electricity and energy usage. So those are some of the broad strategies. Thanks for again giving me the opportunity to speak, and look forward to answering questions a little bit later.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chad, so much. Professor Nolan? Do we still have you? I think we might have lost him temporarily. So in that case, Maxine, can you start sharing your presentation?
Sure.
Thank you.
Let's see. Give me just a second.
I know I'm putting you on the spot.
No, that's okay. Although actually I realize that I have tea going, so I'll start it, but we may have a moment that I have to stop. All right, can folks see my screen okay?
Looks good.
Excellent. Well, my name is Maxine Paul. Thanks for having me. I work for Adelante Consulting. We are a small employee-owned environmental and climate consulting firm based out of New Mexico. I'm going to be talking about just a bunch of different projects we're doing, generally in the Southwest. We also work Internationally, we've worked with some companies based out of different countries. Our clients in general include government agencies, small governments, organizations, industry, and we work with Los Alamos National Laboratory as well. I came to Adelante just last year from the Pueblo of Santa Ana, which is a federally recognized tribal nation in central New Mexico, and I ran environmental programs there. And I'll talk a little bit about that work just to have a little bit of a tribal perspective going forward. Whoops, there we go. So briefly, I'm going to go over 4 different kinds of projects that we do: low carbon fuel standard verifications and advocacy, biomass feasibility studies, solar planning and Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act programs, and then some carbon strategy for NGOs in the region. We talked about decarbonization, the definition of decarbonization, that is, and I want to sort of zoom in on the definition of decarbonization in terms of the low carbon fuel standard, which we'll talk about next. But just to say that it's really talking about fewer greenhouse gas emissions. So your carbon dioxide, your methane, your nitrous oxide, your fluorinated gases within a specific boundary of that transportation sector, which, as I believe it was Chad or someone else noted earlier, is the major source of emissions in California. So this chart is showing California emissions in 2020, and so within that, to also define the low carbon fuel standard before we get into what we do with it, it's a regulation in California and in a couple other states, I believe it's Oregon and Washington, that requires a lower carbon intensity of fuels over time in a given system. And so this chart shows you that like there's a requirement for decreasing carbon intensity. And so that means that fuels are contributing less to greenhouse gases in that pie piece. There's a lot of requirements in the low carbon fuel standard. It's a really hefty law, and it helps make, well, I'll get into this a little bit, but basically, we have a lot of carbon credit markets out there that don't have a standardized reporting method, and that, you have problems with additionality and all these things. The low carbon fuel standard really doesn't have those kind of problems. There are some issues in it, but overall it works, and those are mainly with like land use. So it's really a broad, from this little chart at the bottom shows like we're talking about the feedstock to the vehicle fueling and the operation, and it's gonna go. And it's been working. So this chart by Stillwater shows just a greater and greater portion of the fuels market, including all of these lower carbon alternatives, from ethanol to renewable diesel to more electricity, even within producing oil and gas, right? So what we do is we verify those credits. We're a verification body. We've gone through that training, and we've done over 80 of these kind of inventories through CARB, including other ones. There's a couple different programs that CARB has, like the cap and trade program, a couple other carbon credit programs. We also did the first urban composting carbon credit project in New Mexico, and we work on advocacy with the Low Carbon Fuels Coalition and through the New Mexico Clean Fuels Group to try to get these standards in place in multiple states. So this is fun because this is timely. HB 426, which we were lobbying on, has just passed the New Mexico House Energy, Environment, and Natural Resources Committee about an hour ago. So that's moving forward, and we're excited about that. And is there anything else I wanted to say on this? Yeah, really just that, I drive an e-Golf and I'm really happy with it, but there's so many gasoline vehicles out there and engines that are not going to be retired. So although this isn't like the major solution, it helps address all those vehicles that will continue to use gas, because we, short of some way to exchange them fairly, we're still gonna have all these vehicles on the road. We have to do something about that. So we've also done feasibility studies around biomass and electric generating facilities and biochar. This is something that, again, is not, solar power is going to be a bigger bang for your buck in terms of the decarbonization aspect, the carbon intensity aspect. However, biomass in New Mexico can be really helpful for other important elements of the economy that can lead into more and more decarbonization. So, for example, we've had a number of the biggest wildfires in history over the last 10 years. And this past May, we had a fire that was really two fires that combined, that started with a controlled burn. It was insane, and there's a lot of disaster recovery dollars going towards it now, finally. But in the meantime, you know, these type of fires are causing, because we have more and more of these fires with extreme weather, we're getting more and more emissions from those fires and more degradation of those watersheds and degradation of those carbon sinks. And so anything that we can do that's going to keep those forests intact, and in the case of biomass, you're talking about a marrying of those fire safe practices as well as an economic development project. You know, so in some of our studies, we saw good carbon negative outcomes, but I think I just wanted an asterisk there that, you know, biomass is still burning fossil fuel, not fossil fuels, it's still burning, it's still combustion. So you're still having the emissions of the electricity generation. It's just that in the production of that, you're getting fewer emissions. So moving on to another thing that we do, and I'm going to touch a little bit on what I did at Santa Ana, but we help governments and communities access Inflation Reduction Act funding and the implementation of that funding, because we've found that there's, you know, a huge bottleneck between all the money that's out there and all the folks who really need it. There are programs in community energy efficiency. There's programs in energizing rural communities. So that's a prize that's coming up. There's the Advanced Energy Manufacturing and Recycling Grant Program. There's programs for carbon capture and storage. There's, you know, more money into programs that already existed through some of the BIA funding. And with all these programs, you know, there's, as many people have touched on, there's just such a broad variety of projects that need to be done and funding that's out there. And a lot of that is in not only, and I think someone had a question about this, but grid resilience and building out more lines, as well as weatherizing the lines that already exist. And that's definitely an issue in New Mexico. We get some extreme weather. As far as building out things like microgrids and community solar, I didn't realize this, but through this presentation, I've realized that I've done quite a bit of sort of planner work under that, not being a planner myself, but at Santa Ana, we utilized one of these funding programs to get more buy-in from the community and sort of promote solar, instead of just going about, putting up an array through one of the deployment programs. We really needed to expand that interest. And so we put together a workshop that brought together the Sandia National Labs, Tommy Ventures, which is the business arm of the Pueblo, a group called Indigenous Collaborators, a team that is really excellent at doing this kind of thing, consensus-based collaboration and planning, and a company, Woven Energy, and representatives across the community came together to put together the first really comprehensive energy plan, considering really the history of energy development there and how to go about it in a way that makes sense for that community. We ended up sort of doing some basic steps at the end. Besides coming up with this plan in a community, we also had Grid Alternatives worked with us to get funding through the Tribal Solar Accelerator Fund to put some, rooftop solar on and just get people more used to solar. And now hopefully they'll start to, broaden that extent and do maybe community solar in New Mexico. the regulations around community solar are still being developed. And this year was just the first year that there was community solar applications being accepted. There's still a lot of issues there. After the regulation passed, there's just all the policies within and applications that have been sort of an issue. I realize I'm a little over time, so I'm gonna wrap it up real quick here. But I just want to say that it's exciting for tribes. There's so many opportunities because they don't, the regulation that carved out and made clear that, you know, tribal sovereignty is paramount there and that they don't have to follow state rules as they shouldn't. And so there's a lot of opportunity there to do a lot of renewable energy development if it's in the tribe's best interest. So the last thing is we were working with CORE, which is a 501c3 that works on energy efficiency and electrification in Central Colorado. They do energy assessments, rebates, etc. They do grants. They're sort of a quasi-governmental organization. They do building IQ, and we're helping them manage their carbon strategy, as well as potentially become a regional hub for some of this funding. That's the short version, and then I will wrap up here and just say thank you so much. You can use this QR code to go to our website, and I'll stick around for questions.
Okay, thanks, Maxine. And speaking of electrical resilience, John's, or Professor Nolan rather, his resort lost power. So hopefully he can come back online, and but we'll keep his presentation toward the end. So Greg, are you able to prep up your presentation?
Yeah,
All
that's really funny.
I don't know if he finds it so funny.
Yeah, no, that's true.
I think he's a little bit worried, but yeah. So thank you for teeing that up. Great.
Sure. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, like Donnie introduced me, I'm an architect for Smith Group. We're a large architecture firm, and my focus is really on buildings. So I'm kind of going to bring a slightly different perspective to the conversation of decarbonization, really from kind of a building scale. But I think there's a lot of interesting overlap with the planning ramifications. So we've been talking about decarbonization. Why is it so important? Because scientists are telling us to divert the 1.5 degrees Celsius climate change, we need to reduce emissions by 65% by 2030. And I have every confidence that we're going to get to 80% by 2050. I think technology is amazing, and the huge focus that we're having on decarbonization is great. But what I'm not seeing enough of is how we're going to get this massive emission reduction in a very short amount of time, and that's really critical. So I'm not going to talk a lot about net zero energy, but I did want to briefly say that the way we approach net zero energy in general is this kind of method where we start by looking at economies of scale. So every building is typically part of some kind of district, and how can that building be relate to its immediate context and look for district scale solutions to reduce its energy demand. Someone's waste heat is another building's perfect waste heat source. And then my huge thing is I really push for passive design. And I think, even if energy consumption of buildings was completely carbon free, I still think we need to design passive buildings because of the resilience in case your power does run out. Also, I think we're just happier as humans in environments where we're connected to the sun and the wind and rain. And then and only then do we need to look at smart building technologies. And then and only then, that's when the renewables come in, because we don't want to design energy hogs that need thousands of PVs when we can design really tight, efficient buildings that use much less renewable energy. And on passive design, what I'm seeing as an architect is that we are shifting some of the budgeting on our buildings to put more money in the building envelope and less money in the mechanical systems. And that's important because, money is a limited resource as well. So we need to stop thinking about green as always adding more cost, but thinking about sustainability, energy efficiency is not really adding cost, but it's just shifting costs from systems to envelopes. So what I really do want to focus a lot on is embodied carbon, because it is really critical, and I'll show you why. But just to define it for everyone, embodied carbon is the amount of energy, carbon emissions that come out of the materials that go into our buildings and our infrastructure in our cities. And that's from the extraction of those materials to manufacturing them, to transporting them to the site, to maintaining them, replacing them at the end of their service life, ultimately deconstructing them and demolishing them or recycling them into a landfill. So if you look at the entire life cycle of a material, every one of these stages has a carbon impact. And when you add them all up, that's your total embodied carbon of any given material or system. So why is embodied carbon so important? Because this is just looking at a building that was maybe constructed over the last couple of years. There's a huge chunk of energy that goes into the materials that make that building. And then, a building is going to consume energy over its life, and the greenhouse gas emissions of that energy use is going to go down and down as the grid becomes greener and greener. But if you just look at the period between now and 2030, you can see that the embodied carbon impacts are far more significant than the operational impacts between now and 2030. So I want to really focus a lot more on it. Notable too that almost half of those embodied carbon impacts are just from the building structure, because I think that's the critical piece that we think about how can we design buildings that can last, that can be adapted, and that could be flexible enough to accommodate future uses. So the greenest building is one that's already built. We need to really focus and it's hard for an architect to say sometimes, but to build less and to build nothing. Whenever that's a solution, renovating existing buildings, right-sizing programs, doing more with less, we need to really shift the conversation towards that. Because when we get to the point where we're looking at replacing some of the concrete with a cement replacement material, that's going to have a little bit of an impact, but you got to start from the very beginning, from the planning level, about how can we build less to accommodate the same functional need. And then there's the statistic on the right from the Global Energy for Built Environment Construction, which just shows currently that just the core and shell of materials represents 11% of global greenhouse gas emissions. I've seen the stat that 8 to 9% of all greenhouse gas emissions just come from concrete. And I think if you look at the total built environment, including infrastructure, it's a significantly larger number. I think it gets into the 20s. So building operations are certainly important, but embodied carbon is really a critical piece of the puzzle. And as we green our grid, it's going to become the dominant source of emissions in the US. So what's the secret decarbonization recipe for adaptive reuse? It's to take these older buildings, make them much more efficient, electrify them, and then maximize renewable energy. And it's important to note that by 2040, approximately 2/3 of the global building stock is going to be existing buildings that exist today. So it's exciting as architects to focus on new buildings, but we really do need to focus on our existing building stock. So without kind of the widespread decarbonization, we're never going to get to these Paris Agreement targets without a real focus on looking at our existing building stock. And there are tremendous opportunities out there to reduce. And so this is, it takes to account the fact that now we've already done everything we can to right-size the program, to design a flexible building, to adapt and reuse whatever we can. Then what's new? There's technologies out there like CLT. I think every architect is talking about mass timber construction these days, which obviously sequesters carbon in its manufacturing as opposed to concrete or steel. But just there's a lot of exciting products out there that Lance was alluding to that have a significant less embodied carbon footprint. So the kind of right sizing and reuse and eliminating waste piece combined with using smart materials is really how we focus on embodied carbon reductions. So with that kind of recipe and perspective from an architect, I just want to illustrate how we've kind of embraced all of these things into one case study building. The building is headquarters for a regional office for DPR construction, their Sacramento regional office. And it was completed about a couple of years ago, right during the height of the pandemic. And this was an existing building in downtown Sacramento. The image on the top shows what it looked like before we did the adaptive reuse, and the image on the bottom shows the transformation of the building. And the original building, the image on the top was a modification to the building that was done in the 80s, where they kind of ripped off the existing brick and put kind of a stucco IFAS product over it. So part of the adaptive reuse, from a planning perspective, was to kind of make this building, celebrate the history and the legacy and the culture of the community around it in Sacramento. So this is where it is. It was part of a really vibrant part of Sacramento. And I think, in this next image really just gives you a sense of just the quality of this part of Sacramento. So, we're talking a lot about carbon and decarbonization. That's really important. But as we talk about our communities and kind of creating places that, people love, I think that's, another critical aspect about adaptive reuse as well. So it is a net zero energy building in Sacramento. So, a reasonably mild climate, not a really hard one to go net zero on. We were able to take the building and, improve its thermal envelope, add a lot of photovoltaics, optimize daylighting so that we can rely less on lighting, create natural ventilation strategies so that we can rely less on mechanical heating and cooling. And, then and only then we added photovoltaics to meet its current energy demand with renewables. I love kind of the challenges that adapting existing buildings can have. This existing building had a basement that was unused and really was not usable for any kind of program spaces. And the design idea was to turn that into a thermal labyrinth. So all of the fresh air that comes into the building passes through this basement concrete thermal mass walls. The walls remain a fairly steady temperature throughout the summer and the winter, and that kind of preheats or pre-cools the air before it has to be conditioned to go into the building. So just kind of creative uses of these existing buildings, really opportunities for energy efficiency. And then the new addition that we did add, we added the west part of the building was 2 stories, the east part of the building was 1 story. We turned that 1-story building, intensified it by adding a 2nd story to it. That was conceived of as natural ventilation, operable walls, connections to the outdoors, so that we can really comfortably live in this building without any energy consumption for large portions of the year. And I'm not going to get into all of this, but these are the kinds of strategies that get you to net zero. And we understood the potential for energy production on the site, and we set an energy target to be within that solar availability. And then we came up with a series of architectural and engineering solutions to get us there. I will say that, net zero isn't necessarily critical. I think the grid harmonized buildings are more critical for some of the reasons that the other panelists talked about. But for this small project, net zero was obtainable. And then and only then the renewables. And we didn't have enough a rooftop to get the building to net zero, because we're also adding skylights and solar tubes and a lot of other strategies. But putting photovoltaic over the surface parking is a really good strategy. Not only does it produce power, but it also provides shade and helps from microclimate effects that parking lots can often have. And then the addition to this building was all done in mass timber. CLT construction using cross-laminated timber and glue lam columns and beams. The contractor loved it. So this was a construction company that we did this design for. It was all panelized. It came together really quickly. It didn't involve a lot of waste. And it has a significantly lower embodied carbon than steel or concrete, but moreover, you can just leave it exposed. In this case, we didn't have a fire resistant rating requirement. So that not only does it become this carbon solution, but really adds a lot of beauty, and it minimizes the need for additional materials like drywall or ceiling tiles. And just basically it's an exposed structural shell. I got another picture of it. And then, yeah, we incorporated a seed bank into the building as a resilient design strategy. So some of the kind of key species that were being destroyed in California due to wildflowers, we're literally banking the seeds for those species so that they can be replanted. And I think just putting all of this stuff together, adaptive reuse, there's a lot of kind of strategies to improve community health as well as occupant health, net zero energy, low embodied carbon. It all comes together. And if we had more projects like this, I think this is really what the future of decarbonization needs to look like for the next 10 years at least. So with that, I wanted to go quickly, and hopefully we have time for Professor Nolan, who's joined us again. Thanks.
Thanks, Greg. Professor Nolan, can you bring up your presentation? Great. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Donnie?
Yep.
I can hear you and we can see your presentation.
I really hate to contribute to the characterization of Mexico as a place where this kind of stuff happens, because it doesn't. We spend a lot of time trying to work with many populations in our work, as all of you do, and I hate to be contributing to this. It's not the way it normally is down here, but it just was an amazing coincidence. So I'm going to try to edit my PowerPoint down to maybe 5 minutes so that we do have a little bit of time left for questions. And I wanted to point out that the reason I call this presentation The Mysterious Power of Land Use Law is that most people, although all planners, but most people don't know how much authority local governments have to affect new technologies like decarbonized building materials. And yet, although the GSA has a lot of jurisdiction, every single private sector building that's built or substantially rehabbed in this country has to go through a local planning board. So what we do is work on enabling those local planning boards to have the legal authority. That's why we're a land use law center, to be able to do things like keep up with technological change and do carbon mitigation, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and affect equity, et cetera. So we're now seeing, as happens almost always, as a new important technology like decarbonized building material come into play, we're seeing local governments adopting them. And I just want to point out for those few of you who don't know that the reason that this works this way is because all 50 states have given zoning enabling authority to local governments, which sets standards that buildings must meet, and then local boards review and approve building projects, and then grant building permits if standards are met. So the result can be low carbon buildings. You already heard that land use can touch, municipalities can touch up to 75% of fossil fuel sources, including sequestration. And I would like to make a point about that, but we can have a lot of ability to sequester carbon through local land use law. And the way we've got to low carbon land use is through TOD, mixed use zoning, green buildings, infill, adaptive reuse, retrofitting buildings, complete streets. And understand again that none of these things can exist. The private sector can't just come in unless it's GSA, of course, and do these things. It has to be approved legally through this chain of command that I just made you aware of. So what we're finding is I have 40 students, we have 40,000 local governments, and we get out on the internet and we look for change, positive change, progressive change, moving in directions that we think are important. And once we started looking for low carbon building materials strategies, we found the following. I'm reading now from something I didn't put on the slide. We have one community that has an embodied carbon calculator tool. We have another one that has a net zero action plan. We have another one that has a carbon intensity target. That's Denver. We have a low carbon concrete compliance form that has to be filled out and presented to a planning board. One local government that we know of has done low carbon building material requirements under the International Green Construction Code, which has a lot of potential for other communities. We have a community that adopted zoning regulating embodied carbon concrete. And then we have another community that has come up with a zero carbon certification. And I'm gonna end with that and just say that at the end, we should be talking about the compelling power of land use law. And if you have any questions about how we can empower local governments in the 50 states to do what you're all talking about today, I'd be happy to respond. So thank you very much for putting up with this craziness.
Okay, thanks, Professor Nolan. And we understand the conditions. And thank you for joining back in to the call and the webinar. So we do have some questions. One question that Greg, you would like to answer or could potentially answer. Could you elaborate on the timing and magnitude of reducing net embodied carbon in concrete? The question further elaborates that we've heard structural engineers that specialize in concrete mixed design say this is a very, very difficult thing to accomplish.
Sure. I think so the primary method that we're using to kind of minimize the embodied carbon of concrete is using cement replacement materials, pozzolans like fly ash, granulated blast furnace slag. Those are the big ones. And classically, we've written our structural concrete specs to say you can have a maximum quantity of these cement replacement materials. And increasingly, we're writing specs that kind of go beyond that and say these are the minimum level of cement replacement materials. They do extend cure time of concrete, and it does just take a lot of coordination with your contractor to make sure your pouring schedule's aligned with that. And then I want to highlight, there's a transition to Portland limestone cement in a lot of regions within the country, and that's going to reduce embodied carbon a lot. And then we're seeing technologies like carbon cure, where during the production of the concrete, they're taking some of the carbon dioxide that's a byproduct of the cement replacement, and then turning it directly into the concrete, and that can reduce concrete emissions by 10%. So I think with a lot of the kind of new legislation that's going around the country that's setting these embodied carbon or global warming potential thresholds for concrete, we're going to start to see this real widespread adoption of people becoming more for the cement replacement products become more available and codes to change to kind of allow these products and structural engineers to kind of get a chance to warm up to them. It's an area that's constantly changing really rapidly. So something a structural engineer read 3 years ago may no longer be valid. So it's a challenge.
And I'd like to jump in on this as well. It's we've also heard that the real problem right now is the early high strength, trying to achieve early high strength. So in the actual design and planning process, if you can work out through the design that you don't need to have high early strength, you design a different way, different structural method, or look at that construction methodology of how that building's coming together, then you can greatly reduce that early high strength requirement, and then that gives you that opportunity to use all those things that Greg was bringing up.
Okay, thanks, Greg and Lance. Maxine, we had a comment on the board about hybrid versus all electric vehicles and the debate around Toyota's position in the industry. Perhaps you can just share that with the larger group.
Sure. I was sort of addressing, I think, not sure that I'm addressing exactly the question, because I vaguely recall a different comment from Toyota, but there were a couple op-eds out recently, I think one of the Times that addressed, or it may have, I'm not going to get who did what right, but basically there's this argument that, well, big EVs are more carbon intensive than small gas-powered vehicles or hybrids. And that's not, some of that argument isn't accurate in terms of the use of that vehicle. So these Ford F-150s, all of the embodied carbon, right, going into producing one, and then how much it needs to charge per mile that it's driven and what the grid is, right? That's not inaccurate. However, the people that are buying a Ford F-150, replacing it with a Ford Lightning, that it's sometimes it's comparing apples to oranges to say, well, EVs are the same as gas-powered cars because you're buying the biggest EV possible compared to the smallest and most efficient gas vehicle. So someone who's buying a Hummer is not gonna otherwise buy a very small Toyota So the markets are different, so the comparison is weird. But I think it does shed light on something that's important, which is that, it's the efficiency of the car. The switch is it's not as simple as just everyone needs to get an EV. It's also that we need to green the grid, that we need to drive less in general, we have to have fewer vehicle miles traveled, all of these things. And that, no, if you are driving a Prius, don't go and buy a EV Hummer, because they're just apples for apples. So yeah, if you're driving a Prius, your next car needs to be completely electric.
It also goes to show not to judge an article by its heading alone, because I saw that article as well. So read the articles and get the information. Okay. We also had a comment about as we were beginning to work more aggressively toward decarbonizing buildings, shifting away from fossil fuels and increasing our reliance on electricity, including renewables. Are we having enough conversations around the capacity and reliability of the electrical grid, as we have experienced today? As we experience more extreme weather events and wider temperature swings, are we setting ourselves up for disaster by failing to provide the electrical infrastructure necessary to sustain this energy switch? And Chad, you provided a written comment, but Lance, you also had some thoughts on this question?
Yeah, it's Chad and I were both chatting back and forth on the background over here. It's just I think it's a really good, important question. We are having lots of conversations with electric utilities about their ability to produce carbon-free electricity, and then really looking at the planning aspect of how do you actually produce 24/7 CFE. And how does that then start to work into our neighborhoods and communities and buildings? What are those various opportunities to do that? So we're looking at more microgrids, or we're looking at much smaller infrastructure than the huge infrastructure that we currently have out there. And so ways to break that down into smaller chunks, so where that the impact, if there were a failure, is much smaller as opposed to what we currently see. And then Chad, I know you had some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I was also wanted to add I think everyone is worried about it. I think there's a lot of discussion taking place, and it's a concern about how resilient and hardened our current electric grid is, even before it transitioned to renewables. See California. And so a lot of those investments need to take place regardless of where our electricity is coming from. And also, I mean, a key part of the conversation is also including storage for resilience benefits, both today, but also as we transition to higher renewables. Is pairing with storage does give you the ability to be more resilient in case there's a power outage. There's also, vehicle to grid. So as our electric vehicles can be mobile power plants, or use that battery to power other activities. And I mean, our current economy is highly reliant on electricity already. That if the electricity goes out, we are in real trouble. And even if you have a natural gas fired furnace and you're in a cold climate, or a natural gas hot water heater, those won't work without electricity. So even today, if you're using fossil fuels, you need the electricity to turn it on and to keep it running and keep it moving. So it's not really a question of, as we move to renewables, do we need to be more resilient? We just need to be more resilient. And then there are opportunities. And I think as we move to a more distributed energy system that comes from a number of different sources that aren't large centralized plants, that if those go offline, they cause significant impacts versus one or two solar PV systems that might go offline, or a couple of wind turbines that temporarily go offline. There's much more resilience built into a system that is relying on a lot of diverse and different sources of electricity, also including hydropower or geothermal and other sources of electricity as well, not just wind and solar. Those can count as renewables too, as well as keeping and maintaining the current nuclear fleet so that it's currently safely being operated. I think is also a critical component. I mean, folks differ around whether we should build any new nuclear plants, but we do have a bunch of them, and it's in everyone's best interest that they continue to operate safely.
Okay. Any panelists want to weigh in?
And I just added that we've been tracking the advent of microgrids that are required by local land use authorities. Pittsburgh, for example, has a sustainability incentive program where it gives points to developers and therefore more density if they contribute to a microgrid system. I don't know how far that's been taken. My view is limited by the view I have of local governments doing these things, but we have an energy law center that says that that's a viable solution in some places.
Donnie, can I jump in real quick for a question for Professor Nolan?
Sure.
I know one of the things we face where I live over near Annapolis, Maryland, is forests essentially being cut down for new developments. The planning departments are allowing, more and more housing, more and more shopping centers, sort of. And there's a large group of us really trying to preserve these forests for that sort of carbon sink, and then the reduction or the elimination of sort of new carbon being added. What are you seeing sort of around the country from a planning perspective to sort of help preserve those forests from a carbon perspective?
Well, there's a lot of work our students are beginning to do on tree preservation, on mitigating the urban heat island effect, on tree canopy expansions, and directly on stewardship of forests. And one of the most significant accomplishments is nearby where you are, and that is Charles County, Maryland, where they have a no net tree loss policy, and it's legislated. And that little planning board, that little mysterious planning board at the local level, has to receive a local tree preservation ordinance and monitoring of this over the years that it's been in effect. And they have achieved net zero tree loss.
Thank you, Professor Nolan. So we are going to take a 10-minute break. I think we just hit the 3:21 hour, so a 9-minute break. So if everybody can return back to your computers and screens at 3:30, Shannon will be moderating the systems thinking panel. Thank you to all of our decarbonizing panelists.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is the last session of the symposium, and we will be exploring how planners can apply systems thinking. I'm Shannon Roberts. I'm an urban planner with Jacobs and the co-chair of Partnerships Committee for the APA Sustainable Communities Division. I'll be moderating the session. When this topic first came up, there seemed to be a shared understanding of what system thinking was, but then a lot of different ideas about systems thinking. And one of those that I was thinking of, I mentioned earlier that I'm a member of the Oneida Tribe of Wisconsin, and I was raised with the philosophy of the 7 generations. So thinking about how every major decision you make, you should think about the 7 generations that went before you and the 7 generations that went after you. And just think about if we did that, if from a climate perspective, that'd be pretty powerful. But that's my, I guess, contribution to this discussion as a moderator. But to start off this topic and set the framework for our discussion will be Scott Edmondson, a senior planner and economist in San Francisco Planning's Data and Analytics Group and principal at sustainability2030.com. Our second speaker is Kristen Weeks, a leader in regenerative design and founder of BioStudio. She'll be providing an ecosystem perspective and discussing biomimetic, I knew I was going to mess it up, biomimetic infrastructure systems, Following Kirsten will be Mark Reiner, Director of Resilient Infrastructure at Jacobs, and he'll be looking at systems thinking from an engineering perspective and how all built environment professionals need to be part of this systems thinking solution. Lastly, Sandy Medler, she's an education practice area leader and principal at Gensler. We'll discuss how urban land use functions as a system and how and where we should build to address challenges of sustainability and equity. So Scott, you're up, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great, thank you, Sharon. Appreciate it. Great, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss how I've applied systems thinking to my sustainability practice and yielding regenerative urbanism as a platform for inventing sustainability success. Just like to acknowledge contributions from Charles Kelly over the past 10 years. He's a principal at Green Urban Design. Today, I'm going to talk about our sustainability practice predicament, some key aspects of systems thinking, why to use it, how to use it, and review 3 cases very briefly and close with a call to action. Sustainability practice faces a predicament: accelerating life support system insecurity. And this after 30 years of practice since Rio. We've made limited progress, but not success. We can't grow the current economy without crashing nature, the fundamental economy upon which our human economy depends. Net result, our current approach may not produce sustainability, at least in time. Why? Mainly, we treat symptoms, not the source. We see the problem as environmental instead of as economic. We use static, not dynamic systems lenses and approaches, and we misspecify sustainability, making sustainable parts, buildings and cars, instead of making sustainable systems. What to do? Maybe we need a new approach. Sustainability is a system state, a system condition. It's not a part. Maybe we need to make sustainable systems, not sustainable parts. Jan Gall was famous for saying, an endless number of green buildings do not make a sustainable city, pointing directly at the systems challenge. Now I'd like to review some key aspects of my experience with systems thinking and invite you to reflect a bit on what your experience has been with systems thinking in your practice. Systems thinking is a different lens for a different result. Reality is a complex, nonlinear, dynamic system, yet our traditional tools and lenses are static, linear, and presume independent parts. With this static approach, today's solutions breed tomorrow's problems, because those solutions change the system in unforeseen ways. What are the central features of systems? A system is an interconnected set of elements that's coherently organized to achieve something. Donella Meadows, Thinking in Systems. Reality is a dynamic nested system of systems. Systems behavior arises from the relationship between the parts, not the parts. Systems change is often not linear, smooth, or slow, but exponential, discontinuous, surprisingly fast, and potentially irreversible. And the whole system, as we know, is greater than the sum of its parts because systems have emergent behavior that's unpredictable from the parts. We need a systems approach for a systems reality. My experience with systems thinking and planning design has started with the recognition that reality is complex. I've seen it shift then to interdisciplinary approaches, underlying the logic of our comp plans to generate citywide performance, and move and expand into ecosystems approaches of the architects and planners in the late 20th century and accelerating into regenerative design in the 21st century. All of these have roots and threads into more formal practices of systems thinking. And when applied to sustainability, we often add a strategic planning component to it, although the Natural Step or the International Living Futures Institute. Formally, it's a discipline for seeing wholes. It's the basis for shifting the mind from seeing static parts to dynamic wholes, interrelationships, system structures, points of high leverage change, shifting to become active shapers of reality and creating the future instead of reacting to the present. In short, they help us address the complexity of systems breakdown problems, which are the naughty, wicked problems of the 21st century. And they yield a capacity to navigate complex systems and systems change effectively. Informally, systems thinking is a powerful thinking tool that can generate routine and paradigm shifting insights, such as what's the real value of energy efficient buildings? When scaled across the economy, they enable the necessary renewable energy economy, yet our policies are based only on the limited value of fossil fuel savings to the building. What's the role of the built environment in the future distributed renewable energy economy? It could function as a massive stationary solar energy plant if we used photovoltaic building materials. Yet this potential is not even being considered when it would be the enabling anchor of that economy. Now, having reviewed a few key points of systems thinking, we can ask, why apply systems thinking to sustainability practice? I found that using systems thinking in my sustainability planning practice revealed the antidote for our predicament. Over time, I connected the dots from our current ad hoc green planning design to the urban metabolism of city sustainability when fully scaled, from regeneration as the core concept to those of regenerative built environment and regenerative urbanism, and the new systems planning and designing practice that will produce it. From the built economy, from the built environment to the economy, revealing the built environment economy connection that links the regenerative built environment to the regenerative built economy, which in turn is the foundation for and spur to the larger ecological economy that we need. It produces the metabolism of city and societal sustainability instead of unsustainability. Now, this connection, connecting the built environment to the economy, is transformational and key to sustainability success. When we realize that the built environment is the built economy, we see how our profession's roles shift to being society's lead agents of sustainability success. We're either planning and designing unsustainable or sustainable built environments, economies, and communities. As such, our profession's value propositions increase exponentially, from creating nice-to-have aesthetic value, which is often value engineered out, to creating must-have economic value, which we now must value engineer in for sustainability success by planning and designing the regenerative built environment and associated sustainability economy. As a result, we can now finally design a win-win future of jobs and the environment and resolve the classic but false trade-off that's been a barrier to sustainability progress for decades. Now, how do we do this shift from part sustainability to system sustainability? First, by redefining understanding and practice around regeneration as the core principle and producing regenerative built environments as our primary product. By shifting from a focus on silos to systems. Now, this shift connects the human economy and society to the biosphere's living system, not with net negative impact mitigation as we do now, but at the foundational level of operating principles and systems performance imperatives that produce sustainability and success. And we can do it simply by catching the wave of the emerging approach. There's no need to invent it anew. It's already bubbling up in our practice as innovation. It's accelerated over the last 10 years, but it's been there for 20 plus. In planning, formulate the policies and rules. In urban design, add water and habitat. In architecture, prioritize energy efficiency and biophilia. In landscape architecture, shift from aesthetics to habitat creation. In utilities, shift from gray to green urban infrastructure. You simply need to recognize it, learn it, grab it, and go. Then we can make the key move. We can connect our current sustainability planning and designing practice to the regenerative living systems performance imperatives of sustainability. Doing so produces the system sustainability, not unsustainability, disequilibrium, and collapse. But what are these imperatives? The imperatives are as follows. We adopt them for our human systems and innovate to system sustainability performance to reclaim and produce life support system security for human and ecological systems. These are our North Stars of sustainability. Make full cost decisions, 100% renewable energy, 100% organic food production, no waste by design, 100% continuous material cycling by design, no destruction of nature. In short, we use what we might now term biosystems mimicry to create the regenerative built environment, which is part of and in turn spurs the creation of the larger circular ecological economy of sustainability. Connecting our work to achieving the regenerative system sustainability imperatives eliminates the real gap to sustainability success, which we need to innovate with our planning, design, and other practices. It shows us the right direction, the big moves as follows: enhancing both ecological and economic carrying capacity by design, and continually increasing productivity through innovation. Redefining regulations that stop simply reducing impacts and start eliminating impacts at their source. Using new geodesign and procedural system simulation tools, which enable the next generation of systems planning and design practice, because they allow us to learn, test, and scale good planning, design, and sustainability practice quickly. Making the market for regenerative urbanism. Practice is way ahead of the market. We can start buying it now from leading consultants if we know what we're looking for, using existing budgets for maintenance, repair, and replacement decisions. We do that to start reconfiguring cities as regenerative life support systems. Our challenge then is to use regenerative urbanism to create a circular, regenerative, ecological built environment, economy, and community. To do so, we must specify and pursue the innovation and investment program that will create regenerative built environments and the larger circular ecological economy, which when scaled globally, will create inclusive prosperity for 9 billion of us by 2050, having only positive environmental impacts. Doing so would restore damaged nature, reverse climate change in time, expand human and natural system productivity, and it's the only solution for the twin challenges of climate change and unsustainability. Briefly review 3 cases with you. These indicate sort of progress towards regenerative urban metabolism and economy from a regenerative built environment. In Kashinawa, Japan, they created an innovation campus and a smart city neighborhood that's the largest platinum certified LEED neighborhood plan, and pursued an innovation in governance in particular to invent a new agency, combined public-private academic partnership and collaboration capable of going all the way to sustainability success, working across sectors and up and down the systems hierarchies. In Central Soma in San Francisco, we tested these regenerative city ideas on an active area planning project. And the main innovation was integrating water, heat, and waste cycling with 4 big ideas: district water heat exchange, coordinated blue-green infrastructure, connected blocks and buildings, and integrated resource and material cycling. And a high-level pro forma revealed about $2 billion of market value premium from regenerative metabolism performance. In the Albina neighborhood in Portland, a highway cover project was used to reconnect land uses using green infrastructure as the basis for creating regenerative system sustainability in a mixed-use district for intergenerational wealth creation, and creating a governing entity to restore and enhance this Black historic Albina community. In summary, regenerative urbanism is the antidote to our predicament. It's an emerging systems innovation for sustainability success arising organically through our profession's innovation that needs to be grabbed and fully developed. It's the only approach that will establish the economy of inclusive global prosperity in perpetuity. In addition, it's also essential for generating the collaboration needed for climate change success. That is, this economy is needed. And it's a better business model. It's the only approach that will simultaneously mitigate the twin challenges of climate change and unsustainability, and only for the cost of climate change. It's the best defense against the increasingly hostile conditions that will arise during the 100-year-long plus period of climate success recalibration. And it transforms and expands our profession's value in a new role that society needs, leading society to sustainability success. Regenerative urbanism is a new call to practice capable of achieving sustainability success in time. And it does so by shifting to regenerative systems practices, connecting systems imperatives, innovating to systems performance, leveraging the built environment economy connection with our new role to create the regenerative built environments underlying sustainability, and testing and scaling with powerful new geodesign and system simulation planning tools. And finally, using existing budgets to start funding regenerative sustainability now. Using existing budgets now to start funding regenerative sustainability instead of continuing accelerating unsustainability. With that, I'd just like to invite you to join the global practice towards regenerative living system sustainability success, with cities around the world now innovating towards regenerative urbanism with bold programs and projects. Please join this path to success. I'd like to end on a question I posed initially: is systems thinking the basis for the new approach needed for sustainability success, shifting from making part sustainability to system sustainability? And with that, I thank you for listening. Please email me for questions and comments. I look forward to your questions and comments shortly. And next up is Kirsten Weeks and our other two presenters who will dive deeper into aspects of regenerative urbanism.
All right, thank you very much, Scott.
Thank
I'm
you.
gonna put my screen up here. And all right, thank you all for being here today. I'm excited to be talking in the systems thinking panel, and I have a lot in common with Scott and my other colleagues who will be following you in terms of thinking about systems. In my segment, I've chosen to focus on the ecosystem perspective. So I hope that this will be inspiring and illuminating for folks. So, and can everybody hear me okay? I guess nobody actually can tell me. I'm going to assume you can hear me okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You're good.
Okay, great, thanks. So starting from the point of a healthy natural ecosystem, and for those who are super savvy about this, we'll just pretend in this image that we're looking at a beautiful natural herd of elk rather than sheep, and that this is a fully functioning natural ecosystem. As you may recall from your school days, or maybe from your professional practice, ecosystems have cycles, intact cycles for water, for example. So we can think about the water in this natural ecosystem coming down as rain, infiltrating and being cooled and cleansed through the ground, accumulating in this beautiful river, being taken up by plants and animals, evapotranspired back to the clouds, at which point it's fully purified, and then all that starting over again. Other cycles, a really important one when we're thinking about climate and buildings, is the carbon cycle. So in this same kind of natural ecosystem, you would see carbon dioxide being fixed through photosynthesis in plants, converted to sugars, converted into carbon in the soil, moving through the through plants, through consumers like the animals, waste products being cycled back into the soil, and not having a net. There's kind of no net release or no net sequester. It's all in balance. In our conventional way of operating, there are a lot of points in which these cycles get broken. You have, carbon in the soil being released as deforestation occurs. We have water, instead of infiltrating, running straight off and causing flooding when we build impermeable hardscapes. We have fossil fuel, we have old carbon that's been held in the ground for thousands plus millions of years being excavated and burned and released directly into the atmosphere. Rather than relying upon the sun, which really the sun is the driver of all these natural cycles. So if we think about an ecosystem and what we can learn for how we might want to design and operate our built environment, I think I see a few key points about how a natural ecosystem operates. Ecosystems operate on 100% solar energy. They produce no net waste. Each participant in the ecosystem's waste becomes food for another. They treat and recycle water. And then fundamentally they're interconnected. So if there's an impact to any one part of the ecosystem, it's felt all throughout the system. And finally, they thrive on diversity. So a biodiverse ecosystem with many different niches, many different needs is the most resilient ecosystem and tolerates disturbances and change. So let's see. My slides are not wanting to advance. There we go. I'm going to illustrate these principles, these ecosystem principles, as they apply in a couple of examples in the built environment. So the first one here is really going to focus on this produce no net waste piece, but as you will see, when we get one part of the cycle working properly, it begins to radiate throughout the system. So this is a project that I did when I was with Arup around 10 years ago. We did a vision for Recology's facilities. Recology manages all of the solid waste and recyclables for the city of San Francisco. So Recology already at that point was a leader in diverting waste from landfill through recycling and through collecting organics in the green bin. But they really wanted to step that up with a vision to transform all of San Francisco's solid waste into resources. So eliminate the concept of waste, basically. So we designed this facility. I was working with I mentioned Arup and also Dave Johnson, who at that time was with William McDonough and Partners, and FME architects who then became Forge, worked closely with us. So we designed this facility to manage almost 1 billion tons of material per year. And I think that this is what it looks like in plan, but it's really best understood in a systems diagram. So here's a really complicated looking systems diagram, but I'll walk you through it. So this is a sand key. So the thickness of each line is in proportion with the quantity of material that's in each of those flows. So we'll just take the green cart, for example, the green stream, which is the food waste and yard waste coming from the whole city. So in this system, we take that material, and we also capture any of that material that is accidentally placed in the black cart, clean it and combine it. We treat it through anaerobic digestion. So that requires some addition of water. You see this blue here, but then ultimately the material is dewatered. So we're kind of squeezing the water out of the organic waste. It really is mostly water, right? These plants are mostly water. So you produce a net amount of usable, treated, recycled water that can be a positive flow to neighboring buildings that are in need of non-potable water. At the same time, we make lots of energy. So this orange bar comes down here, and the digestion process creates biogas, which then gets used in this, or would get used, A, to power all of these operations, create the heat and electricity that's needed, B, to be compressed into vehicle fuel for the collection fleet, and C, go through a fuel cell to produce electricity that can be used. So I won't walk you through all the others, but you can see basically the idea is that we turn all of that solid material into water, compost that can put carbon back into the soil, recycled materials that can go right back into the industrial ecosystem, and lots of energy. So it looks like this in a rendering, and the component, the phase one that's been built already is a facility called the West End down at Recology, where they are transferring those green organic materials to an offsite compost facility until such a time as they may build an anaerobic digestion facility on site. So another example that I want to talk to you about that kind of, so I guess I'll just highlight that in that example, even though it started out as kind of a, materials oriented thing, you can see how the circular economy really is about material and energy and water and connecting up all of these dots within an ecosystem process in the built environment. In this project, all the different elements of that cycle will show up maybe even more clearly at the planning level. So Sacramento Valley Station is a transit-oriented development, as well as a transit station in Sacramento. This is where the Amtrak comes through Sacramento. And the 10 acres around the station are being planned with a mix of office, residential, retail use, as well as new stations for bus and train. The project team includes Perkins and Will as the urban design, urban planner, Grimshaw as the transport architect, Arup as the engineer, and then I worked on this at Arup, and then I'm also working on it with my current firm BioStudio in the next phase that's starting up soon. So back to our diagram of what ecosystems do that we'd like our buildings to do too. Starting all of these actually get rather nicely taken in by a rating system called the Living Community Challenge. If for those familiar with the Living Building Challenge, Living Community Challenge is basically a scaled up planning scale version. And I think it's the closest thing to really looking for a built environment that fully works like an ecosystem. So it's going to touch on each of these points. I'll start with energy, operating on 100% solar energy. So the Living Community Challenge has a number of different tenets that are about achieving net positive carbon, starting with building operations, being 100% renewable energy and combusting no fossil fuels. They address embodied carbon in this embodied carbon footprint imperative, and then they have a lot of different, several different imperatives that really deal with carbon from transportation, which is a central goal of this project, to be really regeneratively sustainable around transportation. This is a diagram from Arup. So looking at how we create the net positive buildings in terms of energy. We always want to start with all the good things that someone earlier mentioned in terms of bioclimatic design, massing passive solar, and making the buildings all electric. This project then has a regenerative utility center at its heart that is going to be producing district thermal energy to be in a really sustainable way, to be piped out to all the buildings. It also has water systems, which I'll get to. Once we have minimized our energy usage through all those steps, then we look at providing generating with on-site PV. And then in a really dense urban environment like this, we expect to also need to pull some renewable energy from offsite. So we plan to partner with SMUD to obtain green power. In addition to those things on the embodied side, we're just going to be looking at minimizing the embodied carbon and all the different structural materials, hopefully using a lot of wood and bio-based materials, and then low carbon concrete, and offsetting. So what we can't can't design out, we will look at offsetting kind of a one-time carbon offset of construction carbon emissions. And then really this is all about, as I've said, improving transit and reducing carbon emissions from mobility. Around water, Living Community Challenge asks for all water to be treated and recycled on site, and all non-potable water to be supplied from on-site sources. So this project is designed to do that. So we have black water treatment on site that then supplies all of the non-potable uses. And then we're doing a lot of adding of permeability, planting, rain gardens, living roofs, so that we make sure that we reconnect up the water cycle and infiltrate water and protect the water quality in the river nearby. So this piece, I wanted to talk a bunch more about kind of human diversity and the urban kind of cultural ecosystem. I don't have time to do that, but I'll just highlight that this project is really thinking about those things, thinking about being an equitable urban environment. The Living Community Challenge takes this on really seriously in terms of quality of life for everybody and equitable places. So we had a really extensive community engagement process for this project. It has a excellent community art component, but there's a lot more to it than that. But I'll have to kind of just leave that open due to time. But here you can see a rendering. A couple of the important things that we're doing design wise is preserving and revitalizing the historic station and repurposing it. And then there is the community really wanted to see a Chinese heritage garden. This is near Sacramento's Chinatown. So in front of the station, replacing some of the parking is that heritage garden. So this image is just portraying this whole system, and yeah, we're really striving to take inspiration from nature here and create an urban ecosystem that is positive for nature and all people from all walks of life. The last thing that I think is really important to you, I've been working on this analogy around a built ecosystem, but we also need to really importantly understand our place in the real ecosystem. So the project sits just to the right of the river down below there. And really understand, what are the habitat remnants that are around us? How can we become and how can we add to those habitat networks in a meaningful way in order to enhance the overall ecosystem and bring back habitat for urban wildlife. So we're thinking a lot about that as well. Other projects I had hoped to show you, I will just highlight this one. We're working right now on a new project in the Bahamas that's about taking this kind of regenerative design attitude toward a tourism development. So in a place where we're really interested in authentic cultural experiences, but really creating employment and food production, and preserving and enhancing ecosystems that are much closer to a natural state than what we might find in an urban space. So thank you all very much for listening, and I am excited to introduce Mark as the next speaker, and take it away, Mark.
Hey, thanks, Kirsten. Hopefully we can keep this conversation going. So I'll share mine. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing that because the part. And can you hear me? We had problems with this before. So
Yep,
I'm Mark.
okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm the Director of Resilient Infrastructure at Jacobs. I'm indeed a civil engineer. And for the last 5 years, I've tried to jump up and down in front of urban planners to engage in a conversation about the urban planning role in infrastructure planning as a whole. That 100% of all of our food, fuel, materials, energy, water is transported by roads, rail, pipes, and wires. So you could also say 100% of our economy, 100% of what makes a city viable, decarbonization, all the carbon that's carried in our infrastructure is a direct connection to it, but we don't have language for it. We've resolved that engineers and utilities can have their own language for their own sector, their own KPIs, their own key performance indicators. But as urban planners, we all, so everybody living in the city, everybody depending on the infrastructure as a whole, we don't have a language for how we talk about this as a whole. So my language from an urban planning point of view is disruption. And we know we have an aging infrastructure crisis, but engineers don't use the term aging infrastructure. It's about condition. So right away, there's a failure to communicate in terms of what is going on. So you can see the road is closed sign. It doesn't say because of a water main break or potholes. It just says the road is closed. So to us, that's a disruption. It is not sector specific. It is holistic, actually, but it is a disruption. In New York City, the roads are cut open 550 times a day. Toronto patches 20,000 potholes in every January. Despite robust asset management and that language for the water sector, we still have 720 water main breaks per day in the US. And we've just become a nerd that, these disruptions are just chronic to all cities. The problem is it chronic equitably? How do we talk about it? What is the loss of our economy based on all these disruptions? So I'm going to switch over, and this is the problem we've had. You should hear, it'll be 3 20-second videos. I'm going to have to get out and come back in and make sure my audio is working again. But what you're going to see is just one event. It's a large water main break in Philadelphia, literally 1 year ago, or about a year ago. And you're going to see the 20 seconds of the event, 20 seconds of the water engineer from their perspective using their KPIs, and then 20 seconds from the community's perspective.
Mark, I think you're gonna have to reshare this again because the sound's not coming through. We just hear you typing.
Okay, sorry. I don't know. If it doesn't happen, this is the second time. Okay, let me try it again.
Impacting a few homes, an entire neighborhood is now trying to clean up from the destruction caused by all this water.
Knows how old their mains are. They know where the mains are. What's stopping the water department from going in and fixing them before we have a disaster like this?
I mean, you want to get as much out of a water main as you can, and we have an aggressive replacement strategy. Philadelphia actually has a lower main break average than most cities across the city. We have about 25 breaks per 100 miles, and we have an aggressive replacement strategy. So we replace them as quickly as we can when we need to.
The basement is, flooded. I don't even know, that'll mess with the foundation of the house. I'm very concerned.
Okay, you should hear me now.
Yep, we hear you.
Okay, hopefully you heard the videos. Sorry about that. So that King Sessing neighborhood in Philadelphia, the stars where that large water main break occurred. This is a 3D representation of transit or transportation on the day of that break. It's a 42-inch diameter. This is what happened after the water main break. So from a water utility point of view, their sole asset is there at that intersection of Springfield Avenue and 56th Street. 28 square blocks were flooded. And so the residents had a much larger view. So this is what happens to the transportation after that water main break. Think of the economy in here, though. Think of the local businesses. How are they being repaid? There is indemnification, meaning the utilities do not have to pay. They just are there to replace their water main break, and you need water main break flood insurance to be compensated. So there's a lot of social costs here involved. So over the last few years, started this concept of with the New York City Department of Design and Construction. Their research arm is called Town and Gown. And we've been leading capstone studies with NYU Tandon. And the idea is, how do we create the KPIs of where we are being disrupted in the city? So a little over a year ago, a dashboard was created about showing 311 data, police accident reports, DOT lane closures. Just finished this with NYU Tandon as well. Like, what is the impact of transportation change due to failed infrastructure? This is currently happening and will finish in spring with University of Toronto. How do we engage community members to understand the buried infrastructure? There's been a lot of work with the things you can see. And currently we're trying to put all this together in terms of how are community economics impacted by failed or disrupted infrastructure. So this is the challenge right here. How do we include infrastructure disruptions in urban planning? There's dollar value impacts across the board, what we call social costs. And ASCE has tried to put a number on this, American Society of Civil Engineers, that in addition to the utility bills we pay, each household will have an average loss of $275 a month through 2039. The problem is, I don't like average. I mean, so is this an average, or how is this being done with equity? So with that said, I'm going to switch over to how do we do this in integrate new infrastructure into the existing built environment. So I'm going to move over to Los Angeles, and hopefully you can see it. Somebody ring in there if you can't. So I'm going to start with, power plants that give us energy, and it's all color coded. Orange is solar, lime green is nuclear. We can talk about our pipelines. So all of our energy and all that is subjected to natural hazards. So it's a big mess out there, right? So there's a lot that can go wrong, and we just need to understand it. So even an earthquake can impact 12 bridges and that type of thing. But I'm not going to focus on the big picture. I'm actually going to go to below the streets of Los Angeles. And this is a demo data set. So I'm not going to show you the actual most vulnerable place in Los Angeles. It's demo data. But it's based on a lot of open source data, and there's a lot of truth to what you're about to see, that a city of 3.5 million, 7,600 miles of water main. This is all color coded, and it's actual data that the red here is going to be considered beyond service life. So this is 1907 cast iron water main. So red just means it's well beyond the intended service life. Pre-World War I, this is potable water. And you can see there's equity here, right? So one thing about aging infrastructure is it doesn't discriminate too bad. Same with the big pipes of sanitation for LA. Again, 7,600 miles, and I'll just click on that one. It's another vitrified clay pipe from pre-World War I. So below the streets of LA is a lot of pre-World War I infrastructure that we depend on. You go to something you can see like pavement conditions, and this is not just LA, but almost every city in the United States, where this is where equity comes in. People recognize this. This is the 311 data you call and complain about. So there's bias in that data. But you can see generally we try and keep our streets at least looking good, even though below the streets is kind of a mess. The real issue here is how do we look at all these key 6 sectors at the same time and make it manageable for planners to, how do we wrap our heads around it? So what I'm going to do now is when I hit analyze, and there's obviously a lot more we can talk about here. but it's looking at all the vulnerabilities across all those 6 sectors and up to 54 subsectors of infrastructure. And it's showing you where in the city we have these key spots. And so that's represented by this heat map. The redder spots are more key, but now we can dive into specific cells. And I will tie this to how we use it for new infrastructure planning. So again, you can start to see all the little pieces in that one cell. They're all cyan, and too much to go through here. But now we're starting to see, okay, where in our city do we have vulnerabilities? And of course, we can also bring in, believe it or not, every city has to do, or every county at least has to do a hazard mitigation plan. So we can bring in their specific hazards that they're worried about. So for example, fire hazard. And there's some on the north, but there's also one down here. All right. So we can bring in a fire hazard and look at it in terms of the infrastructure hazards too. How do natural hazards exacerbate existing infrastructure vulnerabilities? So we're mixing acute hazards with chronic hazards. So chronic hazard being the aging infrastructure. What I'm going to do is swipe in the hazard here, and you can see it'll illuminate some areas that were not impacted. They weren't vulnerable cells prior to the hazard, but afterwards. So we can actually generate, most vulnerable cells by hazard across here. So like landslide is also in this one park. Before I move on. And I know I'm going through this quickly, but I'm just trying to make a point. I'm not trying to sell the tool. I'm trying to engage people in including aging infrastructure in planning. So again, we can look at how natural hazards exacerbate our existing vulnerabilities. I'm going to click that off and move into how do we integrate new infrastructure now. So I'm going to pull back a little bit, and let's bring in the built environment. Actually, it's probably. So what we have here is we start with US Census block data of where all of our schools, fire stations, et cetera, are located. And the darker the blue means more things going on here, and even population density. So this is the highest quintile population density. But we can also weigh things. So we can also say we want the Olympic venues to be weighted highest. So we can have a sense of gravity based on our existing built environment with our subsurface infrastructure vulnerabilities to help us better do capital planning. I'm going to pull back a little bit now so you see a bigger picture here. And this is, this is LA, so it's 1.9 million of those hexagons. And then these are all census blocks, so it's quite a bit of data. But this is an unusual, you probably are the first to have seen a picture like this of infrastructure vulnerabilities below the ground in conjunction with our existing above the ground built environment. So I know it's confusing, so I'll just pull this off and I'll just bring on the Olympic venues. So those are pretty clear. And behind it is infrastructure vulnerabilities, but now I can bring in proposed projects. And this is all open source data. So this is all not specific to a client, but this is a proposed alignment, and we've thrown them together to do an example here of pipelines. And you can see that there's an alignment between a pipeline here and this transit. So they overlap. So with that, I'm going to switch to how do we take all this data and make it a meaningful story to integrate and leave it to the other systems thinking and get into the social aspects. So starting with what you just saw, we can start to add depth to it. What kind of infrastructure are they crossing? Is it old or new? Does it have to be replaced? Are we digging up new infrastructure that was just replaced briefly or not too long ago? We can start to add all the social vulnerabilities. So this is CDC, and this is a histogram along the alignment. So you can see where communities have high vulnerability compared to low vulnerability. And of course, you can break it into one of the 4 themes for the CDC social vulnerability. What I particularly like is I think everybody's responding to the Justice 40. And as you know, it's there's 8 categories that make a community disadvantaged. we've color ramped it so we can actually weigh those 8 categories, whether it's a light purple in one category or dark purple in all 8 categories, because there's a story to be told. So the 8 categories in Justice 40 each have their own indicators of why they are contributing to the disadvantage of the neighborhood. So they have a story to tell. And so we can break it out, and these are the 8 categories along the alignments, the workforce development, transportation, legacy pollution, housing, energy. What is contributing, or how can these new projects contribute to the communities above? So using these terms, we can even just dive in and start bringing in data that you're all familiar with, right? So legacy pollution, what's the air quality index? Where are the brownfields? And start building up the case. So what you see, that dashed line going up and down, is that alignment between the surface project and a buried water project. Well, the surface project is for transportation. And again, this is just public data. Well, you can say, what are the existing metro lines? What stops are being proposed? What is a 5, 10, 15-minute walk time to them? Then you can say, do people want to walk from this area? What is the health? What is the access to parks? Getting into your carbon sequestration, not a lot of carbon sequestration in a concrete jungle. And is it going to get better? No, climate change is here to stay, and it's going to get worse. So what we're trying to do is bring in synergies between projects, understand what the existing environment is doing or built environment is doing, then start after that building up the social foundation for the discussion of how do we merge these two together. You can bring in vision, but at the end of the day, how do you engage and get a community behind a project that's not just a project from an engineering point of view, but the end result is community development. So with that, questions at the end, but I'm going to turn it over to Sandy because I want to hear what she has to say. Is Sandy? Yep.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This has been a really fun panel. Super interesting cross-section of content. Let me share my screen. Not that. Sorry. Excuse me. Great folks there, though. I've got this thing in the way. Love them. View. Oh. Hold on. No. Oh, sorry, preview where we are. Here we go. Well, hi, everybody. It's nice to be here at the end of the panel. That was a really great journey we've been through about all different elements of how we might apply systems thinking to cities and a larger context. And I think my part of this is probably going to look at it in terms of what I call a social ecological system, because we have transformed so much of our natural environment here in the Bay Area and a lot of our cities. They're not purely ecological systems anymore, but I think we could call them social ecological systems. And I'm going to use San Francisco and the Bay Area as a point of example, and just share a few things ways we might adjust our thinking with a systems perspective. So just looking at, oops, sorry. San Francisco first, I think, in some ways, a really great success story about looking at carbon emissions reduction, and the fact that if we look at the window, because there's the statistics are very complete there, we look at the window between 1990 and 2010, population was growing, the GDP was going up, and the emissions were going down. So a lot less emissions per capita. And so in some ways, really great success story on how to grow our way into the future. But, at the same time, we all know, there's growing inequality, income inequality, there's persistent poverty. These statistics are from California overall. We've got a homeless challenge, and, there's something not right about the way we're building into the future. Also, of course, the impacts of climate change are not really being addressed by the focus on individual urban centers. So I think if we want to look at the systems perspective on this, I love this diagram of the iceberg model, and just think it'd be nice to reflect on this for a minute. And you can find this iceberg model at the ecochallenge.org website. But it's sort of, you know, if we talk about systemic thinking, it says to us, you know, what we see, the wildfires, the homeless tents, you know, those things that we see are just the tip of the iceberg, right? And that's an event. But behind that event, there's a pattern and a trend. You know, we're looking at how inequality's been, you know, accelerating, and how carbon emissions are, you know, increasing the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. And then there's those underlying structures that everybody's been talking about today. Like, how do we design our cities, you know, with the expectation that water mains are going to break and we'll get around to replacing them? Or how do we design a system where we're so reliant on the kinds of transportation we have that have all the carbon impacts? So, but I think what's really fascinating is to think about then the mental model underneath. And if we're really looking for transformation, that's where the true transformation comes in. So, you know, what is that mental model, and how do we begin to shift that so that, you know, kind of like simply, Greg Mella talked about adaptive reuse and places that people love. You know, how do we get people to love this idea of the transformation we have to have, so that this becomes, in addition to the must-have, it becomes something we all really want to have. So, you know, just going back again to look at the patterns and to look at the system we've designed, you know, I do love the mapping. I appreciated the mapping of the infrastructure, super fascinating. But if we look at, this is from Cal Enviro's screen, we can look at the mapping of disadvantage, and it's really well known. We know where the red zones mark the higher areas of disadvantage, the green zones less. And this is all about looking at both the threats from pollution as well as the vulnerability of populations to pollution. So it's a great database, because it sort of tells us where those problem areas are and where people are vulnerable. And this is a zoom in looking at San Francisco and looking at the Bay Area, and you can see the areas where there is greater disadvantage. And, you know, our funding models are set up to prioritize funding in those areas so that, you know, after many years of disinvestment, there might be some compensating investment. But, and I think everyone in the room knows this, but it's still fascinating to see, if we talk about, you know, where did this come from and how are we going to transform the system? You know, it came from redlining, and it came from historic patterns, you know, back to the early opening conversation about 7 generations, right? This is generational. And so in order to apply systemic thinking, we need to acknowledge the pattern and then think about how to remake the pattern. So I just think it's fascinating too, if we look at the mapping of carbon emissions as well, you know, I think that it's a wonderful thing to think about transforming our core urban areas to be more sustainable and to lower carbon emissions. But I think one of the challenges is that even when we get the carbon emissions down, this mapping is also available and really great to be able to dial in and look at carbon emissions and how they break down per census area, per census district. But you can see that, you know, you can do great in downtown San Francisco, but there's a much larger context. And part of the reason it's showing dark red with more emissions is because of that transportation component. But it's also, you know, the qualities of construction are different in different areas, and it's complex because of the rising cost of housing in the Bay Area. People are pushed to the edges of the Bay Area in terms of looking for housing. So there's a relationship between where people live and the urban economy of the region. So, you know, back to this sad fact, which is that actually not on track to meet our climate goals. And I think it, you know, it's been recognized that one of the reasons we're not on track to meet the climate goals is because of land use. You know, so we had that great conversation, and I really appreciated John Nolan talking about land use. But I think it seems it's one of these major factors in terms of how we're settling and how we're creating more dispersed settlement patterns. So I just thought I'd share this. I found this super fascinating. So this is a report coming from a report created by Spur. And, they were looking at, let's just look at land use in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they classified it, and these images come from that. And then there was also a really nice follow-up report done by Spur with AECOM, kind of quantifying usages within these areas. And what you're seeing is the mixed use neighborhood in the San Francisco Bay Area, this is all SF Bay Area, uses 1% of the urbanized land. So what we think of as mixed use urban neighborhoods, that's 1% of the urbanized land. It includes both the high density and the more moderate density. And it provides 7% of our housing. And we've got 65% of our housing in single family housing here in the Bay Area. You can see the breakdown between different types of single family housing. But this one I found really fascinating, which is that office parks and industrial areas have 22% of the urbanized land, and they do have 15% of the housing. So when we think about housing and communities and equity, it's really interesting to realize that there's so much discussion about urban and suburban, but there's also this large proportion of folks that are living in probably not the best resourced neighborhoods and in areas that are rapidly changing as our economy changes around office uses and industrial uses. So these are areas of change. And I just think we could think about that when we think about urban regeneration and we think about transformation. These are great areas for transformation. So when we think about transformation, I thought I'd just sort of conclude around just a couple of examples of transformative projects that are looking at how to take what we have and evolve it to much healthier and more sustainable patterns. So first, and in my mind, if I could wave my magic wand, I would have housing for everybody, I'd transform our infrastructure, and I'd create more connected communities. And these are some examples. And so Dignity Moves, I think, is a really exciting project. It's one where, our firm's been involved in this in multiple cities now, and we're looking at scaling up and bringing it a larger scale. But if you think about the mental model behind homelessness and the idea that it's too expensive to address, that people don't want to be in shelters, that neighborhoods don't want them. And so it's interesting. That's part of what I love about this project, which is that, $40,000 per unit, it's using land that is waiting for entitlements and waiting for projects to be built so they can come in for 3 to 5 years and then be moved to another location. So it sort of avoids a lot of the challenge of permanent uses and challenges of neighborhood resistance, because it just drops into empty sites and says, as a society, we have more resources than we're giving ourselves credit for. We have space, we can accommodate, and then the build out of these projects are super lovely because there's artwork integrated, they're fit out by volunteer efforts. People go and they furnish these rooms, and lots of people are able to have that dignity of having a door with a lock, and there's social services. And so it's certainly not the solution to the problem of affordable housing overall. But what I love about it is I do think it starts to shift the thinking about, if we could find the generous way in our communities to tuck in these spaces and provide environments that provide that temporary housing, get people back on their feet. So I think it's a great example of taking a different, looking at more ways to solve the same problem. Also looking at how we solve the challenges of the transformation of our downtowns. There's a lot in the press about how San Francisco is actually the slowest to come back from the pandemic in terms of the downtown, and people are now starting to realize we're probably never going to go back to the same urban use of space and the dominant office market in San Francisco. And from a sustainability perspective, that's a good thing, right? We could rethink the downtown. There's a big effort to that, to how do we rethink the downtown? So we've created a scorecard actually and a method of analyzing buildings for their potential for transformation from office to residential, and been applying that and looking at how we would create a more mixed use environment. Also looking at getting more green space in the downtown. How do we create more truly livable cities is a great challenge, and it needs to happen over time. And one piece of it really is getting more residential uses in single use districts. And some of these transformations are starting to happen, and they do bring more life to urban areas and begin to rebalance and reimagine the way we use our more dense urban areas. We also have aging infrastructure from the dirty energy economy. And so it's really interesting. There's mapping of all of the coal-fired power plants in the United States and like how they might be reused. And there's actually a real effort underway to find creative uses for that infrastructure. And they are kind of magnificent structures in a way. This is a project that we've been envisioning and developing in Ohio. And you can see this reuse of some of the structures. It doesn't all need to be taken out. It's waterfront. It provides access to the waterfront for the community behind, creates a whole area for redevelopment, and really the double benefit of providing housing, providing mixed uses, providing community amenities, but also like the transformation of a negative disamenity to the community. So when I think about transformation, I think about how exciting this future is, that it's really about that. How do we take the disamenities and how do we really move into a future that's much more positive? And Lance had mentioned earlier, what about cutting down forests to build housing? Well, what about transforming the aging, underutilized brownfield environments and creating, and also those commercial districts that are underutilized and producing housing there. The market actually wants multifamily housing, and so there's a lot of opportunity there. And the last one, if we think about, moving to electric cars, what are we going to do with all those gas stations? I just love this one because, when we think about what our communities need, it's lovely to the buildings and the zero carbon and low embodied energy projects, create these like beautiful places, but then where are these places? And a lot of the gas stations are actually at prime corners and prime places of community. And this project for Denver Beer is such a lovely project. It was the total cost of this transformation was $800,000. So to take this little building that was a gas station, and then it was a diner for a period of time, to transform it into this cool place for community gathering. But what's nice about it is instead of just creating the beer company, they have more land adjacent, and they very intentionally created park space, and the people come with their dogs and their kids and they hang out. And I think when we think about transformation and how we create the social ecological patterns for a more sustainable future, I just love to think about projects like this one and how the transformation can really fill a void in communities and be a real positive while addressing our carbon necessity. So with that, I know we're gonna have a question answer section of this conversation, and for those that are interested, I know this book was 2017, so it's not brand new, but I think the points he's making about the systemic challenges and the fact that it's actually the way we concentrate economic activity in core urban areas that's driving a lot of the challenges we have around inequality and also challenging the urban pattern. I think it's a really brilliant and well-written book for those that are interested. And with that, I will stop sharing.
Oh, thank you so much, everybody. That was a great, great presentations. Sandy, the last example of the reincarnation of the gas station to diner to brewery, I think fits in really with the overall theme of this symposium today. The thread between this and the decarbonization is we can't think about just, getting rid of things and demolishing it and what are we going to build new, but kind of reinventing what's been there, I think is really powerful. I have a
And I'll just mention one comment about that. You know, we're a big firm. We do large, shiny projects in a lot of places. We have a real diverse portfolio. That little gas station conversion won our internal design award this year. Just when the internal designers at Gensler said, which project are we most proud of? Like that little gas station project won, because, you know, this is kind of what designers are excited about right now. You know, how do we take this, how do we make things better? So anyway, I thought that was great.
That's wonderful. I did see a question come in for Mark. So Mark, we'll have you go first here. Oh, did you answer it already?
I answered one online, yeah.
Okay. Well, let me go. I have some questions ready to go here. Let's see, Scott. What is the most important contribution planners can make to advancing this emerging practice of regenerative urbanism?
Well, Shannon, thank you for asking. That's gets to the core point. I would answer that by referring people back to that slide that I showed on catching the wave with the 5 or 6 different professional practices that we have, and point out that for me, planners kind of sit at in a gatekeeper role and kind of at a bottleneck in terms of setting up the rules and the regulations that enable sustainability, that enable good planning. And what we often find is that at the project level, we run into lots of barriers. We can't do this, we can't do that, we can't take water across property lines to share resources between buildings, et cetera. And so I think the architects, the landscape architects, the engineers are maybe ahead a bit of planners because they have the technology, they can do things on the ground and their scope is smaller. Planners really need to think about enabling that integration that we need that enables all of these practices to do what needs to be done. And that basically involves kind of reinventing the comp plan around regenerative urbanism and ecosystems approach, and putting in place the values, the policies, the regulations, et cetera, that need to be there that form the context for all of this activity and work and investment and expenditure that everybody else does. And in addition, it gets to kind of Mark's point too about the comp plan can integrate practices across all the different municipal agencies. And that integrative function is probably an underdeveloped function and aspect of our comp planning to date.
This kind of segues a little bit into my next question, which was I wanted Mark to elaborate a bit more on the disconnection between kind of how the different urban stakeholders talk about the problems that are going on. And I'm thinking, you know, planners are kind of grand facilitators. So maybe planners need to start really networking and hanging out, learning how to speak engineer, learning how to speak architect, learning all the different perspectives in order to get everybody integrated. But Mark, can you talk a little bit more about that? I know you talked about engineering looked at the life that was left in the infrastructure.
Service life, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so first of all, the breakdown is everybody hates innovation. So that's a known study that I passed around to this panel. And Scott, you have issues with it, but generally we don't like change. And we go to school, we learn our KPIs, and we get trained in a certain discipline. And so asking somebody to pull back is actually a visceral challenge, right? And how do you start to integrate? So as an engineer, I never had any social classes. I mean, so I'm a liberal arts major before going into engineering, so I had that advantage. But getting into what are the social disruptions that can happen from an infrastructure project is totally foreign language to most engineers. So there's a connection that has to happen. What are the stakeholders asking for? Does the community understand the infrastructure and what they depend on it? So last night it was -8 in Denver. Can you imagine what would happen if electricity went out? I think Scott mentioned that as well. We are fully dependent on this stuff, but we don't have a way of talking about how dependent we are. And so it gets into, we've even siloed our stakeholders. So when we get into just water, there's water supply. It's more on the environmentalism, conservatism. There's water demand, which gets into, xeriscaping and that type of thing. But there's very few people that focused on water distribution until Flint, Michigan, right? Until you got the lead in the water. Now they're like, oh, water is being distributed and non-revenue water leaks. I mean, so we've put our infrastructure in sectors, but then we've divided those sectors up into smaller sectors, and then there's stakeholders for each of those smaller sectors. So there is value in pulling back and having a big picture and seeing who can be integrated into the discussion as a baseline before infrastructure is planned.
Yeah, I think that's very very exciting, but I think infrastructure is one of those things that people don't pay too close of attention to until it goes away. Unfortunately.
Shannon, let me jump on that and on that for a quick second, because I think it's important to understand that, the deeper we get down into these silos, they're there for a reason. I mean, it's really complex. It's really detailed. We need people that know that stuff and know how to do it, and they have to focus on that stuff. And the integration and the coordination that needs to happen is at a much, much higher level. It's the level of values, it's the level of performance that we need. And we can let the experts figure out how to produce that performance, but we need that agreement about the performance. And that's where the comp plan comes in, which is really the constitution for land use and the economy for local areas. And you fight those battles in that moment, as opposed to fighting them where you're going to lose at every project.
So one more thing, then I'll stop.
Get to Sandy's iceberg.
Because I followed this a lot. So when you say engineers should be more focused or even understand, I always use an airline as my example. I don't want my airline engineer to be focusing on social values. I want them to focus on the aluminum strength and get me down safely, right? So when you said that there's expertise that's needed, most definitely. But we have to be able to call up when that expertise is needed, who's impacted by it. So there's different levels of engagement across the professions. So
yeah, there just has to be different measurements, I think. I mean, it's kind of like transportation engineers are starting to finally look at, even if a road has an A rating, that doesn't necessarily mean it's an A rating for everybody, just for the cars. So just to interject there. But Kirsten, I really wanted to hear more about your work with equity and how some of the project that you highlighted at the end of your presentation. If you could just talk a little bit about how things that you did or strategies you did to improve equity.
I do want to talk about that. I know Sandy was trying to make a point in that last question though. Do you want to make your point, Sandy, and then I'll jump in on answer this one?
Well, I just wanted to, sure, just a quick one though, but I think when we think about planning and infrastructure, it's so costly to do infrastructure upgrades in densely occupied areas. It's less expensive to get it right at the beginning, but there's less advocates to get it right in the beginning because there's a lot of these places that aren't even incorporated. And so a lot of the reason why greenfield development is so appealing, right, is because there's nobody there to tell you what to do. So, and I think just thinking about the way the state might be involved in helping to catalyze some of the smart investments in the areas that have less population there. As we grow, the state of California needs a lot more growth in housing. And so it's more cost effective really to do the transformation that's needed in the areas where it's less expensive to do. So I think if we think more holistically about how to transform regionally, we'll do better in terms of overall carbon emission reduction and elevation of quality of life. So just putting that element in there that that the regulation is not the same everywhere and it's more intense where there's more high value development already.
It's like Kirsten's frozen.
No,
As luck would have it, but
20 seconds probably.
yeah, we'll see. We'll see if she's able to jump back on. There is a question in the chat that I don't know if anyone on this panel can answer it, but we can definitely try. It's from a development perspective, do you have any insights about ways planners can incentivize or encourage sustainable developments? For context, in Utah, we can't legally require it. Our state prohibits municipalities from making policy that effectively prohibits any utility like gas. I'll put in my 2 cents here while Kirsten's reconnecting. But I know that different cities that I've seen have passed local zoning and local regulations that basically make it, they fast track developments that incorporate sustainability into their systems. So that might be a way to do it. If you can't outlaw something, you can fast track it if they don't include something in it. But that's just, I work in the private sector, so I don't know if Scott, if you have a thought on that.
You have a real quick one. I would just say that's a great example of needing an intervention at a higher level in the system. So I would say this is an opportunity for planners, for planning, in terms of the organized body, to lobby the state in that particular case. And it's not about a fight about, oh, you have to change this law, it just has to be about renewables only. It's like, open up the question of like, what kind of future do you actually want? How do you get there, right? And answer that question. And planners are, that's what we should be leading on. And you have to go to the level in the system where you can actually solve the problem.
That's a good point. Okay, Kirsten, you are back. You're
sorry
up,
about
and
that.
then you will have the last word before we close out the symposium.
Okay, all right. Well, so yeah, your question about incorporation of equity. There's a whole kind of other section of work that I've been doing the last couple of years that I wanted to talk about, but didn't really have time. But I think I'll actually draw on that to answer your question. So I'm doing a number of projects in East Palo Alto with Just Design, and we've been really focused a lot on, East Palo Alto, for those who don't know, is in Silicon Valley, but really has kind of been, it's one of those, historically redlined out communities, and they've done remarkable things with remarkably few resources, but there are a lot of unmet needs, and I think that in that community, as we started, the first thing that we did there as a group is we worked on a youth arts and music center. And we've been focused a lot on really, really authentic, deep community engagement for that project and then beyond. And it's become, all projects have to do with like some outreach or engagement or whatnot. But when you really take that exercise seriously and ask open-ended questions about kind of, and start to understand like, what is the system of that community looking like? What do they have? What do they not have? Who are the players? And the big question, I think, is what can our project, not to come in and say kind of, do you like this version of our project or that version of our project, but to be asking how, like, let's understand what's really needed in this community and think about how our project could include that. whether or not it was what we sort of set out initially. It's kind of an exercise of program refinement or project alignment. I think that the more projects that actually do that exercise of, are we actually building the right project? Could we include another function or another user group without adding, without blowing our budget, or without, like, I think that the more we can do that sort of thing and also build capacity in the community through that engagement process, like take on interns from the youth community, pay them, like in EPA now, as we've now done two kind of education projects, but in the process we've been working on kind of spinning off a chamber of commerce that they didn't have before, and thinking about land trust. And so I think that there's, I guess that would be my kernel, is sort of, as you're doing the core purpose of your project, can you understand where you fit in that community system and how you can boost up other elements of the community that really need the boost.
That's great. Yeah, it sounds like you're almost like redefining the community stakeholder, and not necessarily, I think a lot of times it's seen as like a gatekeeper, like you got to check the box, you got to engage the community, and this is maybe advocating for more of a partnership with them.
Absolutely.
That's wonderful. Okay, well, we have 2 minutes left. I have a quick few remarks at the end. Thank you all so much. I'm going to share my screen. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you all for participating in our second annual symposium. I want to extend special thanks to all of our panelists, as well as the Sustainable Communities Division leadership, who are instrumental in planning in the support of the symposium, specifically Meryl St. Ledger, Carla Ebenbach, Jesse Abito, Donnie Gors-Kolb, Jennifer Cote, Christina Furman, Matt Buchan, Teresa Townsend, and Prahalad Badami. Finally, as mentioned earlier, the Zoom is available for 3 CM credit hours, and it is available, and it will be available on demand webinar in the near future. Presentations will be posted in the near future, probably about a week, on our website. You should be able to see all the numbers for AICP up here that you can type in and report that you attended this. If you only were able to attend 1 or 2 or all 3, that's wonderful. And thank you so much. Have a good day.